Good evening, everyone. Thank you for your patience. So the procedure tonight is that we're going to start with our Committee of Adjustment matters, and then we'll go to our regularly scheduled council meeting. And I understand that we have at least one delegation this evening, presentation, but we will address that under council. Prior to doing so, we're just going to quickly convene our Committee of Adjustment. Is that your understanding, Ms. Martin? Does that make sense? Okay. So in order to proceed with our Committee of Adjustment, I am going to declare the meeting open. I'll ask any member of the committee, which is all of council here this evening, if you have any disclosure of interest for any applications noted in the agenda. Seeing none, I'll move on. Colleagues, I need a mover and a seconder for the approval of the minutes from the February 15th, 2023 Committee of Adjustment meeting. Councillor Barclay, Councillor Strachan, thank you. Any discussion on those minutes, colleagues? Seeing none, I'll call the question. All in favor? Good. Those carry. So we'll proceed to the item on the agenda this evening, and that is a public hearing for 2410 Beach Road. The Committee of Adjustment will now hold a public meeting to consider application number A0323 for lands located at 2410 Beach Road, Part Lot 24, Concession 6, Geographic Township of Oxford-on-Rideau, now the Municipality of North Grenville, to increase the permitted height of an accessory structure to permit a detached garage. Obviously, this meeting is your opportunity to voice any objections or concerns you may have with respect to the proposed minor variance application. If an appellant does not provide oral submissions or written submissions before the committee makes a decision, you may be refused at the Ontario Lands Tribunal Council. Mr. Mosher is acting today as Secretary-Treasurer and will keep a record summary. And any persons wishing further notice should reach out to Mr. Mosher. Is there anyone here for this public meeting, Committee of Adjustment? Not seeing anything? Oh, I'm sorry, there is someone. Hello. All right. Are you the property owner? Okay, excellent. So I'll pass the meeting over to Ms. Martin. And then, sir, if you wish to say something after the presentation, you're more than welcome to do so, but no obligation. So over to you, Ms. Martin.
Thank you, Your Worship. We'll just advance to the next slide, please. So the request before the committee tonight is to seek relief from section 6.1.7 of our comprehensive zoning bylaw to allow the construction of a detached accessory structure with an increased height of 6.9 meters, whereas the requirement is 6 meters. Next slide, please. So the property is located within the rural area. It is a large rural residential lot, and it has quite a bit of vegetation, so there's adequate screening from adjacent neighbors. Next slide, please. Here's the proposed, just a reference plan as to how the property is to be developed. You'll see the existing house, and that the green rectangular outline, kind of in the bottom of the map, is the proposed location of the garage. Next slide, please. Here's an elevation drawing of the proposed accessory structures. As you see, they're adding some space at the top from a loft perspective with the intent that it could potentially be used in the future as an additional residential unit. So in order to accommodate the extra space in the upper story, they're asking for a 0.9 meter increase in height. Next slide, please. So based on the site plans submitted, the future construction would comply with all the other zone requirements in regards to setbacks and lot coverage. And as mentioned, the increase in height will create that extra space to permit a future additional residential unit should the property owner wish to pursue that venture. Next slide, please. We have not received any comments from any neighboring property owners, and the matter was circulated in accordance with the Planning Act, and we received a letter of no objection from the Rideau Valley Conservation Authority as it relates to their core mandate. So it is staff's recommendation that we support the increase of height for the proposed structure from 6 meters to 6.9 meters, as the variance is considered minor and the intent is in keeping with our comprehensive zoning bylaw and official plan, and it is appropriate for the rural designation. And that ends my presentation. Thank you.
Council colleagues, any questions for Ms. Martin? Ms. Martin, why is it currently prescribed to be 6 meters?
It's the standard that we've established in our zoning bylaws. We do try to a degree to regulate the height of accessory structures so you're not getting structures that are as equal in height as, say, to a house. Not often that we're regulating, although it's deja vu because I know the next application will be dealing with height of an accessory structure as well. But it's not typical that we get a ton of these applications. Certainly it's something we could reconsider and look at when we start to have more of a discussion around additional residential units and accessory structures, particularly in the rural area, so they can be above a garage within a potential loft space.
And does the 6 meters apply no matter where you are in the municipality, rural or urban?
So the zone standards are different for the rural area as they would be for a settlement area, as you will see in the next presentation. There are smaller height standards in areas that are more residential in nature, but ultimately 6 meters in the rural area is common.
Okay. It just seems that 6 meters is a bit conservative, perhaps, in light of how people are, I think, looking to establish those accessory dwelling units, right, potentially with that loft or housing component, if you will. So perhaps it's something to consider for the future, is whether or not they need to be updated, to your point. So that obviously people don't have to come to us, right, to seek permission on what effectively appears to be minor. Council colleagues? Nothing, applicant, are you good? You're good? Okay. All right. So then I will call the question on the motion to allow for the 6.9 variance, and I'll look for a mover and a seconder. Councillor O'Sullivan, Councillor Barclay. Seeing nothing, I'll call the vote. All in favor, please. Good. Thank you. Best of luck. We'll move to our next one, which is, I understand, Brookberry Crescent. Do I have that right? Okay. And do I need to read the notice, right, the public notice meeting again? No. I've done it once. Excellent. So then I'll look to, is it Mr. Mosher or Ms. Martin? Okay. All right, Ms. Martin, you are the Acting Secretary Treasurer, and Mr. Mosher, you'll give the presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Your Worship. If we could have the next slide, please. So it's very similar to the previous application. It's seeking relief from Section 6.17 of the Comprehensive Zoning Bylaw. So one notable exception or difference from this one is that the subject lot you'll see is within a residential subdivision, so there's a lesser standard for height. So instead of 6 meters, the standard is 4.5, and this applicant is seeking to go to 5.1 meters, so it's an increase in 2 feet. Next slide, please. So this is the subject property located within Brookberry Crescent. It's in kind of the southern part of North Grenville in a rural residential subdivision, surrounded by other rural residential subdivisions, although it does back onto a rural property. A little bit further afield, there is Blackwood wood splitting business, so it's kind of in that rural mix of area, but very much within the subdivision. Next slide, please. So for reference, we see the existing dwelling, we see the existing garage, driveway, and there is where the location of the proposed garage is. So this is obviously, it would comply with all other zone standards other than height. Next slide, please. This elevation shows it very well. So just one important note is that height's always measured from the average grade of the structure to the midpoint, so from the peak of the roof to the trusses. And so you see that distance there is shown as 16 foot 8 inches, and so that's a little bit higher than would be permitted. So it's from the ground to that average height above. However, it's very much still in keeping with the residential subdivision, and it really doesn't seem like it would be out of place, so it seems very minor in nature from a staff perspective. Next slide, please. Again, all of the construction would comply with the side yard, rear yard lot coverage, and it would not, no construction would occur on any of the easements for drainage, hydro, etc. within the subdivision. Next slide, please. We did not receive comments from neighboring property owners at the time the slide deck was prepared, but we did receive just a question about the application, although individual didn't leave his email, so we did drop off some information at that house, have not heard anything since, and we did receive a letter of no objection from South Nation Conservation. Next slide, please. So it's our recommendation that the 2 feet increase in height would be minor. It's generally in keeping with that rural residential subdivision, generally conforms to the zoning bylaw and the official plan, and would be desirable for the use of land. I'm happy to answer any questions if there are some.
Colleagues, any questions on this one? Councillor Sullivan, go ahead.
Thank you. I may have missed this, but through you to Mr. Mosher, Is the purpose of having the increased height for a potential secondary residence again?
Thank you, Councillor O'Sullivan. Through you, Your Worship. No, that's not the intention. It's just there would be a loft above it, but at this point in time, there's been no indication that it would be for an additional residential unit.
Okay, thank you. Does the additional height, though, allow that sometime down the road if they wish to do that?
Through Your Worship, in theory, it could allow for it.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, my only question is it an additional garage to the existing garage, or are they replacing one for the other?
Thank you, Your Worship. So it's not a replacement. So the existing home has an attached garage. So it is a detached garage.
Okay, understood. And was there any indication it was for commercial purposes?
No.
Okay. All right. So colleagues, the motion is that the Committee of Adjustment grant relief for the properties located at 110 Brockberry Crescent, being Lot 6 on Registered Plan 15M25, former Township of Oxford-on-Rideau, from the following sections of the Comprehensive Zoning Bylaw 5012, and that is to provide relief from Section 6.1.7 to increase the maximum height of an accessory structure from 4.5 to 5.1 meters. Can I have a mover and a seconder, please? Councillor Strachian, Councillor Barkley, thank you. And I assume the applicant is not in the room, is that right? Oh, they're in the room. Are you satisfied? Is there anything you... It's for storage. Okay. Okay. Excellent, all good. Thank you for that additional context. The property owner is just confirming it is for storage. Awesome. I'll call the question. All in favor? Good. Thanks for being here. We appreciate it. Good luck. Okay. So I think that completes our Committee of Adjustment agenda. Is that correct? So with that in mind, I think we will move to adjournment. And I'll look for a mover and a seconder for adjournment, please. Councillor Barkley, Councillor Strachian, thank you. And we will be adjourning the Committee of Adjustment at 6:50 p.m. I'll call the question. All in favor? Good. Thank you. Okay. So now we'll move to our council agenda. And before I begin with the formalities, you'll note that some of us are wearing pink and I'm wearing blue. And there are two significant weeks. Thank you to Councillor Strachian for bringing the second to my attention. But blue is for Autism Awareness Week, which many of the schools are recognizing, and our pink shirts are an anti-bullying message, particularly focused on the LGBTQ plus community. So thank you, colleagues, for recognizing those days. And I know that there's more information on our website should you wish to learn more. So thank you. So with that, I will move to calling our meeting to order. I should say, and I don't know if there's a section on the agenda this evening that will speak to the recent weather events, but certainly I would like to thank all of our municipal staff, particularly Public Works and Fire, alongside our OPP colleagues and county staff who worked day and night to certainly support our community. During a very tough weather event. It appears that North Grenville was the eye of the storm, if you will. So just want to extend our collective appreciation to staff and also to volunteers and the kindness of neighbors and friends who reached out as people were managing obviously an urgent need for emergency backup systems, generators. We heard of lots of individuals where their sump pump became overwhelmed or wasn't functioning properly. So we do understand that there was a lot of damage, and the kindness of the community was certainly very much on display. If anyone has an urgent need to get to the transfer station, thanks to our Director of Public Works and their team, we've now opened the transfer station 6 days a week, Monday through Saturday, which we really appreciate. And obviously the drop-off of brush and tree debris is free. We are looking at some potential additional measures, but I think those are most timely, if I'm not mistaken. Is that right? We also have 2 yard waste pickup days that were already regularly scheduled. So if you have difficulty getting to the transfer station in Oxford Mills, there were 2 weeks in May that were already previously scheduled for yard waste pickup, and that's where you can use a special bag tag, put the debris out on your regularly scheduled garbage day, and they will pick it up for you. So I'm sure many in the community are eagerly awaiting those days. And finally, there's a number of private contractors in the community that that provide the service of taking debris and other waste materials to the transfer station, so that's also an option. Have I forgotten anything, colleagues? No? Okay. So we'll move on. We're going to go to our land acknowledgement. Who would like to read the land acknowledgement today, council colleagues? Okay, Councillor Barclay, go ahead.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. The municipality of North Grenville acknowledges that the municipality operates on the unceded and unsurrendered territory of the Anishinaabe. We honor the historic relationship of the Haudenosaunee and the Huron-Wendat peoples to this land. We recognize all First Nations, Métis, and Inuit who now call North Grenville their home. We respect and support the need for cultivating a strong relationship with all Indigenous peoples, and we look forward to continuing this conversation and fostering the path towards reconciliation.
Thank you. So the agenda is before you, colleagues. Would someone like to move and second the adoption of the agenda, please? Councillor Sullivan, Councillor Strachian, thank you. I should note that Councillor Deb Wilson has been visiting her grandchildren for the last couple of weeks and returns, I think, this coming Sunday. So that is why she's not with us. So the agenda's been moved and seconded. I'll call the vote. All in favor, please. Thank you. Any disclosures of interest this evening, colleagues, in terms of perceived or real financial benefit or loss deriving from any item on the agenda? Seeing no declarations, we'll move on. And it's my pleasure to invite Caroline Rigoto. I am so sorry, Caroline. Caroline and I know each other through our county life, but I've never said your last name out loud. So thank you. So come on up. And Caroline is going to give us her presentation on affordable housing efforts in Leeds and Grenville. So just have to turn on the mic.
Great. Thank you so much for having me here. I apologize to the group that I have my back to you for the slideshow. But yeah, so thanks for having me. If you want to do the next slide. So I just wanted to take a moment just to talk to you guys in general about affordable housing in the United Counties and just some of the efforts that we've been taking.
You are welcome to sit if you wish. I know at counties we typically stand, but it's whatever you're comfortable with.
I find it's easier when I'm standing
Okay.
if I sit, you
Awesome.
know, but
We're
hopefully that's
good.
okay.
Go ahead.
So my role is a new role that started this year as a part of some of the efforts for affordable housing, So I'm the Affordable Housing Coordinator, so my role is responsible to promote, liaise, and recommend strategies to support, enable, and encourage affordable housing creation in Leeds and Grenville. And I thought I would start right off to talk about what is affordable. So it just depends on who you ask. There's a lot of different definitions out there. The two of the main standard definitions are the first one is through CMHC, which looks at approximately 30% of your household income going towards your shelter, whether it's your mortgage or your rent. And in the county housing department, we use the MMAH definition a lot for our funding programs, which is 80% of the average market rent by unit size. So in the counties, we have created our own rent table. So for the CMHC rent table that is normally referred to, it only looks at Brockville area for rents. So the county staff actually conduct their own rental survey and look at rents all over the county. So everywhere from, Cardinal, Westport, Kemptville, Brockville, Prescott, Gananoque. Basically, wherever we can find a rental listing, we add that to the survey in order to collect an average rent that's more reflective of the entire county in general. So as it is right now, the table is getting updated, but the current table, for instance, for a one-bedroom, the average rent might approximately be $1,125, And then we look at 80% of that being our affordable target, which is $900 per month. So I just thought I would give you a bit of an overview on some of the county-wide programs. Right now, we have some affordable housing rental units, but in addition to that, we also have a home ownership program, a housing allowance program, and our secondary suite program. And I just thought I'd show a quick slide of some of our affordable units. So we really do have some beautiful housing units in Leeds and Grenville. So right here in Kemptville, you guys would be familiar with the Jack Street project. That's through Community Living. That's on the upper right-hand side there. And Elgin Seniors is another project. Prescott units on Churchill Drive are county-owned. And a nonprofit provider runs Wall Street Village in Brockville. So I just did a quick slide. It's probably hard to read just with the numbers, just to give you an idea as to where our affordable units currently are located. So we do have them in various areas throughout the county. The majority of our units are actually geared towards seniors or persons with disabilities, but we do have some units that anyone can apply for, and the majority of affordable units right now are one-bedroom size. When I was making my presentation, I asked our housing case manager that processes our applications to just pull a couple files, just to do a little profile, just to give you an idea as to who it is that is applying for housing. So it could be a single senior who's receiving OAS, GIS, and CPP, and their annual income was $22,000. A single person receiving Ontario Disability Support Benefits, their annual income was just under $10,000. Or it could be an employed couple with children with an annual income of approximately $33,000. Persons who are applying for our affordable housing units, there's an income limit, so I just thought I would give you an idea as to what those are, and it goes by the unit size that you're applying for. And there's also an asset limit for applicants, so up to $50,000 with some exceptions. I just thought I'd throw in a slide just to mention rent geared to income, only just to mention that rent geared to income is different than affordable. So if you go to the next slide. So rent geared to income is actually geared to the person's income in that they would pay 30% of their household income for their rent, or a flat rate if they're in receipt of Ontario Works or ODSP. Our affordable rental units have a flat rate based on rent, so it doesn't, once you qualify for your income, your rent doesn't change like it does in the RGI units. So the United Counties is required to provide 987 rent geared to income units as service manager for housing. And we have units located throughout Leeds and Grenville. And they're provided by the county housing department, but also nonprofit and cooperative housing providers. And if anyone is interested in applying or in need, then that's the telephone number they can call to apply. Or there's information and applications that can be found on our website. They can be printed off and people can actually view our properties just to even see what housing is out there. So moving on to some of our affordable housing programs. So the home ownership program is a program that we have that provides down payment assistance for first-time home buyers in the form of a 20-year forgivable loan. Maximum funding is up to 5% of the purchase price to a maximum of $14,000. The current maximum purchase price for an eligible home is $280,000. We're expecting we probably should receive some updated numbers from the ministry soon, because as you can see, there isn't too many homes for sale that are at that. We recognize that you're not going to find too much out there for $280,000, unfortunately, but I am seeing the house prices dropping, thankfully. Persons who are applying for this program, their income cannot exceed $84,000 and their assets cannot exceed $50,000. We also provide a housing allowance program, so it provides financial assistance directly to low-income renters to help make rents more affordable. And I love this program because you can reside anywhere in Leeds and Grenville and receive a housing subsidy. So let's say if you don't have a housing building in your town and you have an adequate unit where you're renting, you can still receive a subsidy in order to sustain you in that unit. And it's portable, so if somebody's receiving it, and they move to another place, it follows them. They can continue to receive it. One of our newest programs is our secondary suite. So they're called all different names. Sometimes they're referred to as an additional residential unit, a garden suite, or in-law suite. And it's a self-contained unit, normally with a private kitchen, bathroom, and a sleeping area. So each municipality in Leeds and Grenville has their own specific requirements related to the creation of a secondary suite, just in terms of their size, location, and what's allowed. There's new regulations allowing as-of-right development for up to 3 units, but it only applies to service lots. So if you're in the city, on city water and sewer services. We have 2 different funding streams for this program. So a homeowner program, which is funded by the province. It's a 15-year interest-free loan of up to $25,000 to create a secondary suite on the property of an applicant's primary residence. And then we have a landlord program, which is a 10-year interest-free forgivable loan of up to $50,000 for small landlords to create a secondary suite on the property of an existing residential rental unit. So the homeowner program, just to tell you a bit more about that, so it is funded by the province, and it's to create a new secondary suite on the property of their primary residence. So let's say if a homeowner applies for it and they own a cottage, as long as the secondary suite is located on their primary residence, it's allowed for them to have additional properties. The landlord program is focused in on if you own for small landlords of 1 to 10 units, and it's adding a unit to an existing residential unit. So for both programs, tenants that reside in the unit must meet eligibility criteria for social housing. So their income must be at or below the income cutoff. Have countable assets below $50,000. And the person can be a relative of the homeowner or landlord. So we recognize that people who are creating the secondary suites, it could be for their in-law, could be for an adult child. So especially if it's, you're sharing your property with somebody. So we built that into the funding where it was allowable. And then the affordable rent caps also apply. So the secondary suites that are funded through this program, the rents do have to remain affordable. So they can be lower than this amount, but they cannot exceed that amount. And they are reviewed annually. To apply for this funding or to even speak to our case manager about the program, let's say if someone's interested in wondering if they would qualify, I would encourage anyone to give them a call and talk to them about their project just to see if it's something that they can work with. Okay, so just the second part of my presentation, I just wanted to move on to talk a little bit about our housing affordability plan. The United Counties of Leeds and Grenville Joint Services Committee had an affordable housing task force, and one of the recommendations of this committee was to contract Dillon Consulting to create a United Counties of Leeds and Grenville affordable housing discussion paper, as well as an affordability plan from that. So just some highlights from the discussion paper of what Dillon Consulting found. So almost half of Leeds and Grenville's population is aging and will require support, such as seniors residents. Intensification and greater diversity of housing is required to meet the varying needs across the county. So the majority of housing stock are single-family homes, and they're looking at how we can encourage greater density. There's a high incidence of core housing need in renter households in the county. And there is a gap in housing affordability, so member and partner municipalities could consider setting appropriate affordable housing targets and decide how to distribute affordable housing. Some of the recommendations from the plan that are being considered are to identify surplus municipal lands that could be converted or used to build affordable housing. So we recently just identified some of those lands. Partner with nonprofit housing providers to identify suitable land or establish a land trust. Purchase a multi-unit building to convert to affordable housing. Create a revolving affordable housing program to fund, to generate funds. Develop outcome-based performance indicators to evaluate progress. and partner with member and partner municipalities to have an ongoing dialogue in affordable housing and work towards housing initiatives. And one of them was to create this position, the Affordable Housing Coordinator, to implement the recommendations of the Dillon Consulting Report. So some of the things that I've been working on are connecting with developers and supporting projects that are in development. I've been working on promoting the secondary suite programs. I'm also looking at setting up a housing summit, which I'm very excited for. So part of that will probably involve, hopefully, an affordable housing development workshop and guest speakers and that sort of thing. And then also working on a county definition of affordable housing just to sort of nail down the one that we're using for our programs. And then that's my contact information. So I'm always happy to talk to anybody about affordable housing, so feel free to give me a call or an email. So that's how you can reach me. And I think that's it. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Carolyn. So any questions, council? I want to say counties colleagues, but no, we're in council, so council colleagues. Deputy Mayor and then Councillor O'Sullivan.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. Through you to Carolyn. Thank you for the presentation. One of the challenges of being a lower tier municipality is that definitions of affordable housing are set by the United Counties. Was there any thought to the Dillon consulting firm in their discussion paper or in their plan, their affordability plan, to having a sort of a made in North Grenville definition of affordability? When you use a average market rent as sort of a guideline, you're talking about the average market rent in the United Counties. But this is a very different part of the United Counties. We're growing so fast, and we indeed have a severe housing shortage and affordability crisis. So any thought to that?
Yes, so through the chair, so in my previous position, I was a policy analyst in housing, so I was the one who did the housing survey, rental survey, and then now one of my other colleagues has taken it on, updating it. So it just depends on, there was one time where we were able to get enough data to have a North Grenville definition, just because in order to get enough listings, I do believe that they have been able to gather more listings this time around, just in order to make a good, solid, data recommendation, just based on, you need more than 4 or 5. It just sort of depends on what's out there. But absolutely, I do recognize, just even from my own experience when looking at the listings, that North Grenville stood out as having higher rents compared to, other places in the county, absolutely. So where we have enough data to support it, that's definitely something that our staff will take a look at. Thank you.
Would it always be United Counties average rather than a North Grenville average? Is that my understanding? Even though if that average does increase, it's still based on all the numbers throughout the United Counties.
So through the chair, so normally we would have a county definition as well, but I do recall, for instance, when the Jack Street project was being created, we did have a North Grenville definition for that particular project, and that's where, when I'm looking at the affordable rents, we have many definitions of what affordable housing is. In different tables, depending on where the funding is coming from, whether it's MMH funding or CMHC. So at that time, the funding allowed us to have a special a submission just for North Grenville. But going forward, we'll have to see if the data supports the ability to do that.
I think I was reflecting, Carolyn, on the Dillon report, and if I'm not mistaken, they divided the counties up into 4 quadrants, right? So that there could be at least the consolidation of sort of information and housing trends based upon where you were situated in the counties. So that hasn't necessarily affected that average, right, market rent that sort of is used as a bit of a baseline, but I have a recollection that there was some recognition of the need to treat different parts of the counties differently, just sort of based upon market forces in particular. I think the other thing, and then I'll recognize Councillor O'Sullivan, is one of the big conversations at the counties is the fact that there are 641 rent geared to income units, which is not a bad number, but that being said, the vast majority of counties managed housing is in Prescott and Brockville, right? So we have a much smaller number allocation of those units, and historically that's because a lot of the provincially managed social housing was in Brockville, and then with downloading, the counties inherited it. And that's why I think projects like the courthouse are really important, because they add, or Jack Street, right, is another example, because they add to our capacity to serve residents. Here, you spoke of seniors, and it's often heartbreaking to see seniors being unable to stay housed in this community or any community that they might have spent decades in, because there's no available rent geared to income units here. So they end up, having to make very difficult choices about where to spend some of their later years, despite, potentially having raised a family here or having, a considerable history here. So I know part of our efforts, both at the counties and in North Grenville and in neighboring municipalities, is to make sure that we can sort of grow that housing stock. But I'll go over to you, Councillor Sullivan. Go ahead.
Thank you, and through you, Your Worship, to Caroline. Thank you for the presentation, Caroline. On slide 12, you mentioned 987 rent geared to income units that the county is required to provide. Has that number increased recently, or has it been status quo for quite a while? I'm just thinking that we definitely need more, and I don't know how long it's at that level.
So through the chair, I can't speak to how long that number has existed, but I do believe it comes from the province. So I think it's something that has been in place for a very, very long time. And so yes, it's provided, those units are the county ones that we deliver ourselves, but also our nonprofit housing providers, and it's tied to our funding. I can't speak very intelligently about how our funding works because it's so convoluted, but.
So it may be time to increase that number.
If I can add, only because as chair of the United Counties Leeds and Grenville Housing Task Force, we had this discussion. So in 2001, I was actually pulling up the report as you were talking, Caroline. We inherited 987 sort of public housing units from the province. In December 2021, we were at 993. So it hasn't changed significantly. Part of the issue is when the downloading took place from the province to respective counties and municipalities, they provided a certain allocation based upon the number of units the counties, United Counties should be providing. And that stipulated number of units has not changed very much, like a variation of like 5 units. As a consequence, any additional housing that the counties would subsidize would be completely borne by the tax base. So the province isn't saying, we'll add 100 units and we'll cost share the subsidy of those units with you. So their subsidy is based upon numbers that are 20 years old now. And as a consequence, for the counties to increase the housing stock would mean it's potentially possible, but it's a significant additional cost for the United Counties to bear, based upon the fact that there's no cost sharing with the province of any additional units beyond the 993. I'd also say that North Grenville never established a not-for-profit or cooperative housing association. So unlike some other communities in the United Counties that established not-for-profit housing corporations, we didn't supplement, we didn't capitalize on, I think, momentum from many years ago to build more units here. So as a consequence, we're really dependent on the county's social housing stock to serve the needs of residents in North Grenville, apart from what we have, which is less than 100 units.
I think the collateral effect of not having housing, when you look at Southbridge, for example, needing staff and can't attract staff because there's nowhere for them to live, and they need lower income rents, and so it's a real fallout from not having the housing, not having the staff. Anyway, I appreciate all your work towards getting something going. Thank you.
Maybe I could say the second, oh, go ahead, Councillor Strachan, go.
Not to interrupt you, Madam Mayor, sorry. Thank you, Carolyn. I appreciate the presentation. I think what we're all touching on here is part of the challenge with what our market looks like in North Grenville and Kemptville specifically, with the housing prices and everything increasing, I think at a far greater rate than what we see elsewhere, or at least the dollar value is much higher. And this is maybe a bit outside of the scope of what you're presenting here, but you know, one of the challenges is that when you look at things like ODSP or CPP or any of those other sort of ways that folks are making some sort of money under those different programs, is that they don't increase anywhere near as fast as the rental market rates do. And so when we start basing affordable housing on the rental market, you wind up getting further and further away from the folks who need it most. And so I'm wondering, has that been explored? I know maybe challenging at the county's level, but just in general, has that been explored to look at what affordability should be based on what funds are actually available, and not necessarily rent geared to income specifically, but just, you know, if ODSP hasn't increased by 20%, but the rental market has in price, then it's unreasonable to say that that affordability is actually going to be maintained. And you know, we all think in most cases know that prices continue to go up and not they don't tend to slide back down as far as they've increased by. So has that kind of a different kind of model been thought of or explored recently?
So through the chair, that's been one of the challenges with coming up with an affordable definition. One thing I've been looking at is actually the City of Toronto. I've read one of their reports where they're looking at shifting theirs to based on your income. So setting sort of an affordable housing table, like the same like we use according to unit sizes, but with something like a cap of the 60th income percentile and then moving downwards. So that's, they're sort of leading the way in that regard, because, you know, Toronto as an example is a great example of extremely high prices. So their average market rent would be extremely high and out of reach. So that's something that's being considered. But we have to look deeper into how all of our funding is tied to see if that's something that'll be allowable. But it's absolutely a consideration that's being looked at. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Maybe, Carolyn, just on our shared behalf, so the Secondary Suites program is a pilot project right by the United Counties, and it was intended to provide incentives, financial incentives, for homeowners to retrofit potentially or establish a secondary suite in their basements or in another part of a home where a secondary suite would make sense. So they're part of Carolyn's work, as she said, is to really champion the secondary suite program. The good news about secondary suites is you're not building additional units as separate dwellings. You're really trying to leverage existing housing to provide that additional dwelling unit for, it could be a family member or, you know, just through a tenant that you might get in a more sort of regular way. So that program is being tested out by the counties to see if there's enough homeowners who wish to go down that path. We know that we see increasingly new homes built with considerations for secondary suites, but there's also a lot of homes with some capacity to accommodate a secondary suite or a basement apartment, or however we might want to characterize it. So if anyone is interested in the secondary suite program, Carolyn can sort of walk you through all of the math and whether or not it works to avail of the financial incentives at the counties. And we'll be evaluating the success of that program, I think, later this year. So go ahead, Councillor Barclay.
Yeah, thank you, Madam Mayor. Just a final question. And one of the recommendations from the Dillon Affordability Plan was to investigate housing levy. And from what I understand, that would be like a surtax, a one-time surtax that residents would pay in order to accumulate some capital to purchase land or start a housing fund. Can you elaborate a little bit more? Is that something that would only happen countywide, or could lower tier municipalities initiate something like that?
Go ahead.
Oh, so through the chair, we've only begun to just sort of look at some of the different reports recommendations. So that's not something I've looked at in depth. I can say I've looked around at other municipalities in Eastern Ontario that do have a capital housing fund that helps support the development of projects. You know, it is something that could be done county-wide, but it would need to be approved through joint services and whatnot. But unfortunately, I don't have the answer as to whether that's something you could do from the lower tier. I mean, that could be explored further. But.
Okay.
Certainly, we could talk to our local MPP and Minister of Housing. I'm sure he would be sort of well aware, right, of the powers within a municipality to do that. I think it may have been done elsewhere, so, but certainly something to explore. Good. Well, thank you, Carolyn, again, for coming up. We appreciate you being here. We see you lots at the counties, but it's nice to see you in Kemptville too, so appreciate it. Thank you. So, council colleagues, we are just moving to receive the presentation entitled Affordable Housing in Leeds and Grenville for information purposes. A mover and a seconder, please. Councillors Strachan, Councillors Barclay and O'Sullivan, I should say. Thank you. And I will call the question on that, please. Good. Thank you, and that carries. Just going back to my agenda, I apologize. Just give me one sec. Thank you, Carolyn. We appreciate it. Take care. So next we'll go to the consent agenda. There's just one item under the consent agenda, colleagues, and that is the minutes from March 15th, 2023. So can I have a mover and a seconder for those minutes, please? Councillor O'Sullivan, Deputy Mayor Barclay, thank you. And I will call the question. All in favor, please? Good. Thank you. So nothing from the Office of the CEO this evening. Director Dunlop, is there anything else you'd like to add in terms of storm recovery? Did I cover all those bases?
I believe you did, Your Worship. I can only add that the Public Works crew are continuing to remove the debris at the edge of the roads with many different methodologies, and we try to get there as quickly as possible, but patience is requested.
Okay. And did you have Public Works staff that weren't able to take a holiday this past weekend owing to the storm recovery?
Well, we did work quite through the Easter weekend,
Okay.
but as well as the fire chief, he was actually on holidays when the incident took place and came back to assist us through this.
Okay. Thanks for the update. So nothing from the Office of the Clerk this evening, is that right? Okay. So then we'll move to Planning and Development, and we have two public meetings this evening. Oh, just one, I apologize. The second one isn't a public meeting. Okay. So we are now holding a public meeting to consider zoning bylaw amendments for the property located at 313 Joseph Street and 322 Jack Street. This meeting, of course, is your opportunity to voice any objections or concerns you may have with respect to the proposed zoning bylaw amendment. If an appellate does not provide oral submissions at this meeting or written submissions before council adopts the proposed amendment, the Ontario Land Tribunal may refuse to consider any objections. Any persons who wish further notice can provide a name and address to the Director of Planning, who's here tonight, Ms. Martin. And following the presentation from staff for the matter being considered, council will hear from the applicant, followed by members of the public who may wish to comment for or against. And following any comments from the public, the applicant will be offered an opportunity to respond. Please be advised that any member of the public wishing to provide written comment regarding the proposed zoning bylaw amendment can still do so after the public meeting is adjourned. So with that in mind, I'm seeing that there's a number of you here for the public meeting. Is that correct? Okay. So after we hear the presentation and do a round with council, if anyone wishes to speak, then obviously I think you know the drill. So you can come down to the front. And I will now go to Ms. Martin for her presentation.
Thank you, Your Worship. I also do want to note that Ms. McQuaig is here from Q9 Planning. She represents the developer, Mr. Webster. She also has a presentation she will be giving following mine.
Okay.
So I'm not certain if you'd like for her to give the presentation. There might be some repetition information, but it might help facilitate answering some questions.
Let's see how far we get with yours. And
Perfect.
We'll go from there.
Right, we'll just advance to the next slide. So a little bit of background on this plan of subdivision. So the original plan of subdivision for this piece of property dates back to 2013, where draft plan approval was provided for 14 single detached dwelling lots. In 2022, the draft plan lapsed, and the developer came forward with a new proposal to support the development of the property. So the proposal for the property is for a plan of subdivision as well as a plan of condominium to allow for the development of 34 townhouse dwelling units and 2 semi-detached dwelling house units. And the 2 semi-detached units would be located on Jack Street, and the townhouses would be internally accessed through a private road. Next slide, please. So just the location of the property, it is between Jack and Joseph Street and is located as well between Victoria and Van Buren. It runs in behind the existing properties, as you see there. Next slide, please. Just the area photograph of the property as well, just showing that it is a vacant parcel within this community. Next slide, please. So this is the site plan showing the proposed development of the property, where you can see the location of the townhouse dwelling units as well as the semi-detached. The proposed development would also facilitate 16 visitor parking spaces on the property. In order to facilitate the development of this plan of subdivision and plan of condominium, there are various zone standards that need to be varied through the residential third density zone, including setbacks, lot area, and frontage. I do note that a lot of the setback variations are internal to the site, so to the existing units, with a few locations from a rear yard perspective being reduced, just given the awkward configuration of the existing lot. We can go to the next slide. So staff undertook a policy review, which is quite detailed within the planning report. So I'll provide a higher level analysis, or we'd be here all evening listening to me talk about policy, which I don't think everyone would like to do. So our provincial policy statement directs that our settlement areas are to be the focus of growth and development. Development should be based on a variety of housing mixes and densities. New development and growth areas should be adjacent to the existing built area and have a compact form. Development should be directed to areas where there are appropriate levels of infrastructure and facilities. Development should be supportive of active transportation, and municipal servicing is the preferred form of servicing for new development. Next slide, please. Our United Counties official plan sits underneath the provincial policy statement and provides strategic planning direction for development across Leeds and Grenville. These policies include that development should be focused to our settlement areas and include compact form and a mix of densities, provide a broad range of housing types, minimize land consumption and reduce servicing costs, and provide for an overall minimum affordable housing target of 25% of all new residential development, and focus our efforts on affordable housing within our existing settlement areas. Next slide, please. So our official plan here in North Grenville provides strategic policy direction for development in North Grenville itself. This includes that growth in Kemptville is to be compact and prioritized in serviced areas, encourages a range of dwelling types according to location, size, affordability, tenure, design, and accessibility in order to provide a broad range of housing, encourages a range of housing density targets, including 21% of all new development to be medium density, so this would include townhouse dwelling units, support the provision of a choice of dwelling types, including an adequate supply of affordable housing, endeavor to have 25% of all new development as affordable, and then it requires various items in regards to residential infill and intensification. So items such as a planning impact analysis, neighborhood character statement, and compatibility report were required as part of the planning rationale to support this proposed development. I do want to note that there were also various additional reports that were provided, as there is a concurrent application for a plan of subdivision and the plan of condominium. So some of the civil side, including the stormwater management report, were provided in support of the application. In regards to neighborhood considerations, the orientation of the development is such that a majority of the townhouse dwelling units will have rear yard amenity space abutting the rear yards of the existing residential units in the area. A majority of the development will be two-story townhouses, so that low profile, we're not dealing with multiple residential units that are higher in profile. There are some three-story townhouse dwelling units that are being proposed, but this would be in areas where there is a larger rear yard setback to the existing neighboring uses, particularly within the southeast corner of the development. The development is proposed to incorporate similar roof lines and building materials that are common within the surrounding area. And again, it has a low-rise profile in nature with front yard setbacks and building orientation being integrated to provide a similar look and feel to the surrounding neighborhood. Next slide, please. In regards to affordable housing, there are 7 additional residential units that are being proposed. A zoning provision has been incorporated into the zoning bylaw through the implementation of a holding zone provision that requires the affordable housing provision to be addressed as part of the subdivision agreement. This is typical for these types of plans of subdivisions that have come forward before council where when we get to that stage of recommendations for draft plan conditions, there's a condition that speaks to the provision of affordable housing. So the zoning will entrench that further, but it will be something that will come through the draft conditions for a plan of subdivision as well. Next slide, please. In regards to site development, servicing will be provided through the private road. Stormwater sewers will be provided outletting into the municipality system on Jack Street. There are 2 storage facilities for stormwater that are proposed on the site, as are demonstrated on the site plan. As mentioned, 16 visitor parking spaces are proposed. This would be an exceedance of the parking standard requirements. Additional landscaping is proposed within rear yard amenity spaces to provide, again, that additional buffering to existing residential neighborhoods, and fences will be required to provide additional privacy to existing neighbors. And typically, from a plan of subdivision standpoint, the municipality will provide within the plan of subdivision the requirement for fencing along shared property lines for privacy. If we go to the next slide, I do want to note that there have been a few red line changes after going back and forth with the consulting team, just to ensure that we got the standards requested and as provided on the site plan correct. So there have been some small deviations, usually between 10 and 30 centimeters, and that's just to allow for when the property is developed. It just, if there's any future deviations, it prevents having to continually come back and open up the zoning bylaw. So there are 2 zone standards that are being proposed. One would be for the semi-detached dwelling units, looking at a reduced minimum front yard from 9 meters to 8 meters, as well as an exterior side yard from 6 meters to 4 meters, and then reducing the minimum interior side yard setbacks from 3 meters to 2.3 meters. In our proposed draft zoning bylaw that is before council for their consideration, you'll notice that maximum lot coverage has been provided as nil. The intent behind that is to avoid triggering a multitude of minor variances when it comes to the placement of structures such as decks. They will still have to meet the minimum yard provisions as established in the zoning bylaw. So typically what we've been finding with some of our newer developments where we don't require maximum lot coverage, the setbacks typically will dictate the size and scale of what can be constructed. So staff aren't concerned that there would be the townhouse dwelling units and then a large residential structure in the rear yard. There are also provisions in our accessory structures that do have some limitations in regards to lot size. Next slide, please. And there is a typo on the slide. I do apologize, and thank you to Councillor Strachan for alerting me to it. It is not 1,150 square meters per dwelling unit. It is 230 square meters minimum lot area for a townhouse unit that currently exists in our zoning bylaw. So the request is to go down to a minimum of 140 square meters for the townhouse units. I do want to note that not all townhouse units will be that minimum of 140, and again, it's owing to the existing lot configuration in being awkward. There are some lots that will have smaller lot frontages. And I believe in Ms. McQuaig's presentation, she actually provides the table that illustrates each of the units and what those standards would, which lots would meet those standards and which would be an exceedance. Minimum lot frontages, and again, these units are which would face internal to the private road, would be 5.29 meters per dwelling unit, with a minimum front yard setback of 4 meters, and again, it's to that internal private road. There are no exterior side yard setbacks being considered. Minimum interior yard setback would be 1.2 meters, and there are a few places where the rear yard would be 3.2 meters, but for the most part, it is being maintained at a greater setback. And again, in order to address the density piece, it's being requested that there be one dwelling unit per 140 square meters. And if we go to the next slide, I always like to insert multiple copies of the site plan because the further we get in, it just makes it easier to go back and refer to. But you can see in certain circumstances where the rear yard is greater or where it might be smaller, just again, based on that lot configuration. Next slide, please. So the municipality has received comments from members of the public, and I do want to note that there are members here who have provided comment who have also indicated that they would that they want to provide their own representation this evening. We did receive comments from Carl Cannon, Robert Murray, Jesse Stewart, and Jesse has indicated that they will be speaking tonight on behalf of many of their neighboring residents, Glenna Burke and Chris Cook. I do want to note that because there is the concurrent zoning and plan of subdivision that's happening, some of these comments did come through the plan of subdivision process, but staff have included them for council's consideration, just because, again, multiple notices did go out within a relatively short amount of time. So comments received to date include construction traffic disrupting the community and creating noise that could be in violation of our bylaws and damage to existing roads. There was a question about how engineering documents are reviewed from a scrutiny level to ensure that the review is not providing a positive review for the developer, so ensuring the municipality is protecting our assets. How do 2- and 3-story townhouses align with the historic image of downtown Kemptville? How can the community be assured that the cost and impacts to infrastructure for the development will not be borne by existing taxpayers? Next slide, please. The proposed development is seen to be too congested. Many residents bought their properties with the understanding that the property was to be a single detached development. This resident had no interest in seeing the property rezoned to accommodate the goals of a developer. Development of this property should strike a balance between need for more housing, safety, and peace of mind for the existing neighborhood. Neighborhood residents, profitability for the developer, and the preservation of Old Town Kemptville. The density is unrealistic for the neighborhood. A resident expressed a need for privacy fencing due to proximity of visitor parking. Concerns were expressed over digging for basements and how the impacts to stone foundations of nearby residents, and they inquired if inspections would be done on neighboring properties or devices placed to monitor seismic activities, and then a question as to who is responsible for damage should it occur. Concerns over spillover parking onto neighboring streets was raised, and a consideration was asked for a reduction in the number of units that were requested. If we go to the next slide, in regards to agency comments, and I do want to note that for the public's benefit, comments that are received by staff are circulated to council for their consideration, so they do receive the comments that are submitted. We do circulate our applications internally to our various departments as well as to external agencies, including the Conservation Authority. Building Division has provided comments that a fire access route is required to be maintained at a minimum of width of 6 meters. And then there was comment that was provided that sanitary and storm cleanup manholes be required to meet minimum spacing requirements under the Ontario Building Code. Bylaw Division provided comments regarding parking and fencing. In relation to our existing bylaws. Emergency and Protective Services provided comments on the maintenance of a fire lane and fire hydrant requirements, and the RVCA indicated they had no concerns related to their core mandate. So given the information, it's the staff's recommendation that the zoning bylaw amendment be adopted to allow for a gentle increase in the density of the property. The proposed development will see the construction of 34 townhouse dwelling units and 2 semi-detached units, and it's considered low-rise in nature. And as mentioned, the developer intends to incorporate architectural detail and materials similar to the surrounding neighborhood. The proposed residential intensification on the property meets the policy intent of the provincial policy statement, United Counties, and municipal official plan, and constitutes good land use planning. I also wanted, just from a process standpoint, because there's been some changes lately to planning process through Bill 23, there is no longer a requirement for public meetings for plans of subdivision. However, the municipal staff are still required to bring forward a report with recommendations in regards to draft plan conditions for a plan of subdivision. One of the benefits is that we do have a zoning bylaw amendment, which does require a public meeting, so there's still some consideration in regards to the merit of the proposed development as to whether or not council would like to see an increase in the density through upzoning from a residential first density to a residential third density. So the comments here received, staff will also take back and endeavor to provide answers to, and as part of informing that plan of subdivision piece, which we also have to address to the United Counties. So that ends my presentation. I will turn it back to you, Your Worship. But as mentioned, Ms. McQuaig also does have a presentation, which she will be more than happy to go through as well.
Okay. Colleagues, anything for Ms. Martin before we welcome the second presentation? Okay, Councillor Barclay.
Yeah, just the last part with the changes of Bill 23, just if you could repeat, the opportunity exists to comment on the merits of the application because we're dealing with a zoning bylaw amendment, but we no longer have the ability to comment on a plan of subdivision, although it's being presented concurrently today, so if you could just, for my sake, and probably the people in attendance here, because it's rather a new development with Bill 23. Thanks.
Through Your Worship's apologies, Deputy Mayor, didn't mean to speak over you. So Bill 23 has removed the ability to have public meetings in regards to plans of subdivision. So where a zoning bylaw amendment is triggered, we get a bit of a unique opportunity where we can hear from the public. Granted, it's in relation to the zoning bylaw amendment, but what staff have found over time is that many of the concerns raised as part of the zoning process is also raised as part of the plan of subdivision process as well. So certainly the comments that are received, and as mentioned, we did receive kind of comments coming through both processes. So, doing our best to try and address them, given that the province has made those significant changes in regards to how public can provide input on plans of subdivision. I do also want to note that the counties is receiving written comment, and some of the individuals who I'm sure are in the room this evening have already done so to Elaine Mallory at the counties. So there's still that mechanism to provide written comment, and that I am aware that Q9 Planning through their planners have been responding to some of the items that have come through the county level as well.
Yeah, I should apologize for not posing that question through you, Madam Mayor.
Thank you. So anything else? Thank you. Councillor Strachan.
Thank you, through Madam Mayor. Thank you, Director Martin, for going through this. I think that there's a lot in here. A lot of it meets some standards and so on. I am unsure about the affordable housing piece, though. So I don't see 25% being reached, and I'm not entirely sure how secondary dwelling units factor in. I'm not what teeth do we have? How is that mandatory, and so on? So the whole picture of what affordable housing looks like in this development, I think, could use some clarification, please.
Yep. Thank you, through your worship, to Councillor Strachan. So the municipality and staff have taken a general approach in regards to additional residential units as providing an opportunity to create new housing that, although it might not hit the traditional market per se, it could be used for someone's family member who, an elderly relative that needs to move in with them. With the housing prices the way they are, they might want to create a space for their children who are young adults and trying to find and establish a place of their own. So although not traditional and harder to regulate from ensuring that longer term affordability, we do intrinsically see it as creating new opportunities for a rental unit, even if it's purpose built for a family member, because to that individual that might be an affordable unit, considering, especially as we look at an aging population and the cost of care and the cost that would be associated with putting an individual into a care facility. Working with our developers, this is something that's newer in regards to the affordable housing piece and becoming more stringent. You start to think of some of our single detached subdivisions that we're working with to have that provision of the additional residential units being provided. Looking at putting it more intrinsically within the subdivision agreement itself, the holding provision is there, so there is room to go back and discuss that 25% piece. They are proposing 7, which is not quite there. 9 would be 25%, but other considerations will come into play, such as unit size, right? The townhouse dwelling unit offers a different opportunity to come in at a potentially lower, and again, I don't have the math on what these units will be sold for, but a potentially lower price bracket than, say, having to construct a single detached dwelling, which would have higher costs when you start to factor in land, servicing, and materials. So that's one thing that we are considering, and that is providing more diverse housing than what we have currently, to try and meet those housing targets of 21% of medium density. But again, kind of long-winded answer in regards to the ARU piece is that it provides a different opportunity for housing than, say, constructing a multi-residential building with multiple residential units. That we could then, from a rental piece, there's a little more that you can do from a site plan control perspective to guarantee those as affordable.
Okay, thank you. And I think, if I may, Madam Mayor, to continue along that, the secondary dwelling units are typically one-bedroom sort of mini apartments, effectively?
Through your worship, they can be. I mean, it's really going to depend on your footprint as to what you can accommodate within the unit. If you're thinking like a basement apartment unit, certainly, a one bedroom may be appropriate, but it's going to depend on the unit itself that's constructed as to what it can accommodate. It could be studio. You could, in a single detached dwelling, you could probably accommodate a 2-bedroom. It's going to depend on each individual unit or dwelling unit as singularly as to what it could accommodate.
So those details have not yet been finalized, is that correct?
That's correct. That would come later in the process. And as mentioned, there is the plan of subdivision piece in which we can further push and address those requirements.
And so the same question applies then to the townhouses, how many bedrooms are in there, or the semi-detached. Those details of how many people, I guess, could potentially live in there have not been determined.
Not at this time. Maybe it might be a question that the developer and their planner could answer just based on the proposed unit size and the dwelling unit types as to what could potentially be accommodated from from a number of bedrooms for an additional residential unit.
Okay, and then this ties into an assumption that's made in one of the reports about 2.5 people living in each of the semi-detached, and I think it's a semi-detached, 2.5 in the townhouses, yeah. So 2.5 seems low to me, but that was, sort of an assumption that's made based on the water usage and so on. So if we don't have it determined yet as to how many people could potentially living there, there's sort of some assumptions that are happening down the line as well for other parts of the report.
Through your worship, so that's a North Grenville statistic based on the last round of our population forecast, including an update that we had in 2020. So those are, that's a value that is derived based on our population projections and data based on the number of people kind of globally or overall per dwelling unit. So yes, it is likely that you could have some units that have families in them, but it's also likely you could have 1 or 2 person households. It's a municipal average that is factored in when you start to look at, especially when you look at generating for capacity allocation, how many people are in the unit and what could be expected to be used from a daily flow perspective.
Okay, understood. Thank you.
Okay, so this is just an initial round for council. The order of events here is that the applicant can also present their presentation, and then we'll go to members of the public, because I know there's some eagerness to make sure comments, from neighbors are on the record. So maybe we'll hear from the applicant quickly. Have any questions of clarification from council, and then we'll go to members of the public, if that works. So welcome, and if you could just say your name again, please.
Good evening, Madam Mayor, members of council. My name is Christine McQuaig. I'm planning consultant with Q9 Planning and Design, and I'm here on behalf of the owner, K-Way Enterprises, Inc., for the proposed subdivision.
Perfect.
Thank you.
I'm just going to grab a glass of water, but I'm listening, and you go ahead.
Thank you. I will try to limit repetition of the information that Ms. Martin had provided. We're familiar with the site and location. You can advance to the next slide. As you can see in this aerial, it's a large block. There's an opportunity to provide that infill within an existing community. And obviously we looked at various ways of layout, with the 2 lot locations at Jack and Joseph. You can kind of visually see how that connection would take place through that open vacant property in the center. Advance to the next slide, please. So it is an irregularly shaped lot, which did create some difficulties in terms of planning our setbacks a little bit. It's within the designated urban settlement area. It's currently zoned R1, and we're seeking the R3 zone. There are other R3 zones within the vicinity, so it is targeted to be sort of more medium density with the towns and the semis. It's currently a vacant lot, as noted, with tree cover and some vegetation, and it is 1.11 hectares in area with frontage, as noted on Jack and Joseph. Advance to the next slide, please. So this is sort of just a snapshot of the general context of the area, which we're familiar with. Next slide, please. So this takes the proposed site plan and really inserts it into the existing block that's bounded by Victoria, Van Buren, Jack and Joseph. And you can see the private road that goes through the community with the locations of visitor parking as well as proposed trees for the site. There is going to be 8 townhouse blocks with 34 units of towns, 1 semi with 2 units on the east side for a 36 total unit count. And as noted, we are looking to have 7 secondary dwelling units, and we are exceeding the parking provided. We did have a public meeting, and we took back the comments, and we understand that parking was one of the considerations, and there was a desire not to see any spillover of parking, and so we wanted to make sure that the visitor parking we provided would be sufficient. There is also a sidewalk along the north section of the private road to facilitate the movement of people who are not in cars and just provide that more pedestrian-friendly environment, which is often overlooked along private roads. There are trees proposed in the rear yards, drainage swale to manage stormwater, and the setbacks and unit sizes are appropriately scaled to be able to accommodate into this existing community with the 2 stories and fairly typical setbacks. And while we are seeking reductions in certain areas, it's really only at the pinch points. The majority of the setbacks that we're seeking are fairly reflective of a general R3 zone, looking at 6-meter front yards, 7.5-meter rear yards, and that sort of typical format that you would see for setbacks. Next slide, please. And so this is really kind of taking you through the areas where you see sort of the typical setbacks that we're looking for. And especially you'll see the rear yard setback pinch point is in sort of the middle of the north block between the 2 sections. And that's really the only pinch point just because of the curve, and it does continue on. So, you know, once you're there in practice, it wouldn't appear as narrow as it looks on that plan, but the majority of them are 7 and over. Next slide, please. So this shows the sort of surrounding zoning that you've got. You've got, you know, R2, R1 to the north, R3 to the west, some R4, obviously commercial further a little bit away. And we are creating this project. We're doing the blocks as subdivision, and the road itself, the private road, is going to be a condo. And that's how we're sort of creating the proposal in terms of ownership and set up for the private development. Next slide, please. So this is taking the site plan and just kind of showing you visually where all those green spaces are, the sidewalk, the visitor parking. It really blows it up. The trees that we've located, we've, you know, made considerations for where the servicing is. You know, like we've said, we've done that initial, the subdivision plan and the condo, and we're looking at where to place everything and figuring out where trees can be planted, where snow storage can be. A lot of those details will be finalized through the subdivision conditions, of course, but we have gotten, you know, as far into this as we can and as needed to get us to this stage tonight. Next slide, please. So this is a proposed elevation, conceptual elevation that we're looking at in terms of materials. So a bit of stone brick, some siding, and just the general materials that we might be looking at in terms of the finished architecture. Next slide, please. So this is the sort of block plan for the subdivision itself. Next slide, please. And this is the establishment of the plan of condominium for the private road and the visitor parking areas as well. So the rationale for the zoning bylaw amendment at a high level, without, you know, going into the very detailed rationalizations for the reductions of the setbacks in the certain pinch points within the development, is that the proposal does contain a range of lot areas, lot frontages, setbacks, but on the whole, the majority of the proposal is consistent with those R3 performance standards. Due to the site configuration, some of those units have reduced performance standards, but they do still remain similar to other previously approved R3 performance standards that we've seen. And again, they're only in certain pinch points. The proposed dwellings can comfortably accommodate the unit types with sufficient amenity spaces and buffers to existing development. Next slide, please. We've gone through, you know, all of the policy in detail, and this does align with the provincial policy statement, the United Counties of Leeds and Grenville official plan, as well as the Municipality of North Grenville official plan, and meets the intent of the zoning bylaw 50-12, and also aligns with the provincial direction to build homes faster and efficiently, taking advantage of that existing infrastructure that's there, and doing what we can to ensure that we are providing affordable housing in whatever way we can, whether it's through ARUs or ADUs or whatever the term is to be applied, and then whatever else can be looked at as we kind of continue the conversation with staff in what that affordable housing approach will be as a part of the lifting, the holding provision that's going to be considered here tonight as part of this application. Next slide, please. So we do have more detailed materials that takes us into the specific setbacks and lot areas for each individual, you know, unit that's going to be within each block, and we can get into those details, but I more want to just get into the nitty-gritty of your comments and your questions and kind of take it from there, if that's all right with everyone. And that concludes the bulk of the presentation for now. Thank you.
Okay, Council, we'll just do a quick round, and then we'll hear from members of the public, and we can certainly invite you back once we've heard from members of the public, but don't go away yet, just because we'll just see if council needs any immediate clarification on the presentation. And I'm so sorry, I've missed your name again. I've forgotten it.
Christine McQuaig.
Christine McQuaig. I have to write that down. Thank you. Christine, thank you.
It's a strange last name.
No, it's really not. It's just me, I promise. It's me, Christine McQuaig. Okay, so anything for Christine at the present time, colleagues? Okay, Councillor Sullivan and Councillor Strakian. And Christine McQuaig is right here. I have her name now, so we're good. Okay, go ahead.
Thank you, through you, Madam Mayor, to Ms. McQuaig. So the 7 additional secondary units are what is going to be considered the affordable housing units, is that correct?
Through you, Madam Mayor, depending on which definition you're looking at, yes, it is the expectation that they would, I believe under the CMHC definition, they would probably qualify. But at this point, we don't know when it's going to be constructed. I can't give an exact answer of what the rent would be, but it is expected that they would be affordable options, and they're affordable also from the sense that if someone is looking to, buy their first home, they can justify that purchase because they now have that additional income. I myself was one of those people that had to put in an additional residential unit to have that extra income in order to be able to afford the home that we had bought. So that's sort of how you have that additional layer of affordability in a community.
Okay, thank you. So the 7 additional secondary dwellings will be built right at the beginning, correct?
Correct. They will be purpose-built rentals.
Okay. And so the owner of that particular unit then would be setting the rent for the secondary unit?
The owner, through you, Madam Mayor, the owner who purchases that lot can rent it out to family. They ultimately have that decision whether they rent it out or not and what price they choose. But it's also to facilitate their affordability as well. So there's kind of the 2 parts to it.
Okay.
And if someone buys the property and they don't plan to live there and they want to rent out both units, the upper unit would then be a lesser rent than if you were renting out a full town on its own. So it results in a variation of price points throughout the development.
Okay, I understand. And 7 units is not quite the 25%. 9 additional units would make the 25%.
That's correct.
Okay. And so assuming there are 7 additional secondary units, what about parking for those 7 units? Do those 7 additional units have to occupy a place in the visitor parking?
So through you, Madam Mayor, it is to my knowledge that there is not a requirement for parking for ARUs in the town of Kemptville. However, understanding the traffic considerations of the community, the units will generally have their parking space in their garage, their parking space in their driveway, and then there's also the additional visitor parking within the development itself. And so that will also serve whoever is renting from the ARUs or the secondary dwelling units.
Okay, all right.
And
Thank
we do exceed the parking requirement for the proposal as a whole.
I understand, but just street parking is not ideal with narrow streets and snow and everything, so.
So, Ms. Martin, if you could flip to the colored concept plan. The proposed visitor parking is, so we need to maintain the 6 meters fire route. So the visitor parking is not right on the roadway. It is inset as its own visitor parking space. So it is off of the road, not kind of on the road, just to clarify.
One more question, if you don't mind. You did mention snow storage somewhere in, and what about waste management? Would the condominium as a group have waste management, or would they put their own waste out at the end of the laneway?
So through you, Madam Mayor, there are a couple of options available for developments such as this. They can hire a private contractor to go through the street and pick up the garbage, or we can work with the town of Kemptville to designate an area, either end or whatever it may be, for pickup on the public streets. But in our discussions with staff, this is a matter of the, that'll be subject to the detailed review as we go through the subdivision conditions.
Okay, thank you, thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, I believe Councillor Strachan, you were next on the list.
Yes, thank you, through you, Madam Mayor. I think you may have just answered my question, because it is a private road. Private road means it's not serviced or maintained by the municipality. So it would be on the residents to come up with some sort of a plan to have garbage and pickup and snow removal and so on from their area, or go to the main road. So I think that's what you just already answered.
Correct, yes. And there would be a condo agreement in place to deal with the common elements aspect of this, which could include the details through which waste management is addressed.
So each dwelling then will have, each property owner, I guess, would have an additional charge that they'd be paying into for, as like a condominium charge? Is that how that's meant to be set up, or?
Generally, yes. There's different legal setups for that, and I'm not a lawyer, so I don't necessarily want to touch that with a 10-foot pole. But yes, there is generally, when you have a condo agreement, there is a small fee. But this isn't a typical condo setup, so it'll be a little bit different, but that's likely the case, yes.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. If there's Councillor Barclay, and then I'll go to the...
Yeah, it was just to follow up to Councillor O'Sullivan's questions
Sure.
about affordable units. Is there any appetite to have 9 additional residential units so you could meet our goal of 25%?
So through you, Madam Mayor, and I'll pause for a second. The architect, Ralph Vandenberg, is present as well. And so when you're doing secondary dwelling units with towns and semis, you're limited with the towns as to where you can have that access, that, single access for the additional unit that's not through the primary unit. So, and then obviously with the setbacks, and you want to have sufficient space for a walkway going out to the private road. So there's limitations as to which unit types can actually accommodate a secondary dwelling unit. So it was a balance between providing different size different size town options, and in terms of the 2-story, the 3-story, some that have ARUs and some that don't. So, but putting that aside, there is an appetite to look at what other affordability options there might be in addition to secondary dwelling units.
Good. Okay. Okay, so then, thank you. We'll invite members of the public to also speak, unless there's something else.
Just one final comment,
Yep.
Mr. Mayor. We do have a traffic consultant here with us tonight.
Okay.
As well as the owner and the architect as well. So if
Okay.
there are questions that relate to either of those things, we can
Okay,
direct them
thank
out.
you, I appreciate that. Why don't we welcome members of the public to speak. I believe a number of you are expecting to speak this evening, is that correct? Amy had mentioned there are individuals wishing to go on the record. Okay. And if you could just state your name and address, that would be helpful. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Samantha Levitt. I am here as the property owner of 305 Joseph Street, which borders this property. Pertinent to my upcoming concerns is that I also border the other development on Victoria Street. So I did have...
Border the other development, the one that was recently approved?
Yes.
Okay, gotcha.
So I did have some clarification questions, and I also had some concerns that I wanted identified. For the purpose of clarification, I was wondering why none of the primary units would be made into affordable housing versus just secondary dwelling units. I also had questions about the additional landscaping for the rear yard spaces that were specified in their additional planning documents that were submitted to the county. I am concerned with the presentation this evening that it was stated that they would still need to meet minimum yard requirements, but if they are submitting setback adjustments, I'm not certain how those minimum yard requirements would be maintained if they are trying to maximize the housing space. With regards to Councillor Strackershan's question about the 2.5 municipal unit average of people, I was wondering if this is drawn strictly from townhouses in the North Grenville area or all dwelling units, which would include apartments. And then with regards to traffic, I am wondering if a crosswalk will be installed across the private road on either side, as this is a popular dog walking and child walking route. And with the increase in traffic going through this private road, I would be concerned about collisions. Additionally, I'm wondering if any of the old growth trees currently on the property will be retained. And then with regards to parking, having lived in similar condo arrangements across the Ottawa area, I do know that most condominium groups do not allow permanent residents in the property to use visitor parking on a consistent basis. I know that that can't be determined today without the condominium group being assigned, but it does play into parking planning because if the secondary units are all having people who have cars, then that's potentially an additional 7 cars that won't be allowed in the visitor parking. Okay. So, sorry, that was a lot. With regards to my concerns, primarily they deal with stormwater drainage and environmental consequences of the building. So my question, I guess, with regards to stormwater drainage is that I understand, having already communicated with the developer, that a stormwater plan has been designed so as to limit the amount of stormwater that would be exiting these properties. However, I am not certain if that takes into account that another development is going on just behind it, and if the combined effect of these two developments together may actually disrupt the stormwater in an unanticipated way if the two developers are not communicating with each other about the stormwater plans. Of course, being a lover of wildlife and gardening, my property currently is certified as a wildlife-friendly habitat. And in keeping with my certification, I am concerned about the wildlife in the area being displaced from the developments, and particularly how the additional water drainage will affect the local flora and fauna. Pertinent to the wildlife piece, I am wondering as well about the environmental assessment that was conducted. I did review the documents in advance to this meeting that were available, and I had contacted the developer about the presence of butternut trees on the property, which are a species at risk or an endangered tree. I'm not sure where they qualify in that classification. But my understanding is that they are endangered across the province of Ontario, though they are slightly more common in our area as they tend to grow in clumps. I was told that no species were identified, but on reviewing the documents that wasn't specified anywhere in the reports, so I'm wondering how that conclusion was made, especially given that we have butternut trees in our property that have seeded plentifully across our yard, and given that our yard is bordering the property and development, I find it exceedingly unlikely that there are not endangered trees on the property. And I did have some additional concerns about lighting that I addressed with the property developer directly, simply requesting a minimum of lighting due to the abundance of fireflies in the area that require minimum lighting at night in order to propagate. And also I had made a suggestion of considering alternatives to sod in pursuit of better drainage on the property, as we know that sod is actually not native to our area and is pretty terrible at absorbing water effectively. So other native species that are mowable are available through different producers across Canada and would be a more sustainable alternative for the microenvironment. And I believe that's it. Thank you.
So why don't we welcome anyone else who wishes to speak? Come on down, and then we can call on the applicants' other colleagues to answer some of the questions that have yet to be addressed. Thanks. Welcome. Just name and address. Nice to see you again.
Thank you. Nice to
It's
see
for
you
the
again,
record.
too.
It's for the record.
For the record, Robert
Yeah.
Moray,
Welcome,
32
Robert.
Victoria Avenue.
Yep.
Thank you for fixing the chair. I don't feel like George Bailey and Mr. Potter any longer. So, I guess some of the things have been mentioned by neighbor and some other questions. I guess a point of to make in both presentations, it was talked about the minor variances being due to the property not conforming to the design. Well, it's usually the design that conforms to the property, right? And so maybe there wouldn't need to be as many variances if there was 1 unit less or 2 units less in the overall number of townhomes presented. So the drainage issue is always of a concern, as you know, when I've presented before. This elevation, if you stand at one end of the property or even on our block, it goes basically from the southwest to the northeast. And so, which makes sense because you've got a creek that goes along the east side of the properties on Jack Street, and then we've got the Kemptville Creek at the end of Jack Street. So there'll be swales. I've taken note of that and put in place. Unfortunately, we're not a fully infrastructured neighborhood. It wasn't designed that way because it wasn't designed. It came about with the historical use of the properties in the area as Kemptville grew. So there is no stormwater infrastructure. So when we talk about using available infrastructure for intensification and densification, we don't have that in this neighborhood. We have no stormwater along Joseph Street, no stormwater along Victoria. So it's all going to be directed downhill to Jack Street. Now, being a resident of 33 years plus, I was there when Jack Street was redone. And so I know there was some thought put to this property when they did it, but it wasn't put to having as large a property developed because it didn't exist at the time that way. So I'd be worried that if everything in this large property, this tract of land, was all being directed down the Jack Street stormwater. We know when that was developed, some of the basins that were supposed to go there weren't put in. There's one missing at the end of Victoria and at Jack. But the concept here is that there has to be some assurance that down the road, it's all great to say now that we have engineering reports that meet the specifications, and which is what you have to do. But what are the ways and means for residents that are impacted down the road by the fact that maybe there was a mistake or a misjudgment made and the capacities were not as they thought they would be? We've been tested most recently in the last 7 days. We had 50 millimeters worth of rain come through. Not a lot of systems handle that much rain in a short period of time. And most insurance, property and casualty insurance companies in Canada these days don't cover groundwater. Groundwater is what would happen if you have overflow coming from systems because there's not adequate absorption any longer in the surrounding properties. And so I'm just making that point, and I would really like to understand going forward in any instances, what are the ways and means for people to follow up? I know that you have a plan of subdivision put in place, and there is some bylaw enforcement later on, but I know for a fact even the light industrial building that's on Jack Street had 2 beautiful trees that they took down, and that were part of the subdivision, and I asked the town about that 15, 20 years ago, and it never got put back. So there's that type of thing. The plan of subdivision is great, but unless it's enforced, the intent of the plan of subdivision doesn't carry through. And how does that happen? So I'm just reading my notes here, sorry. I guess the other thing, and this again is a prime example in the last 7 days, sump pumps. People will, when they have no electricity, have gas pumps going, right? And if you've got rows of townhomes, you can't take your pipe and bring it out to the road usually. You're going to bring it out and throw it on the ground, right? And you're going to have water, excess water, coming out of these sumps into the backyards of all these people. So the swales will be there, and the swale will bring the water back towards them, or they'll overflow. So there has to be some understanding of how the sump pumps will be draining in normal times and bad times. Normal times, as was the case with the proposed apartment building on Victoria, the initial engineering report talked to connecting it to the stormwater. Well, there's no stormwater, so they had to find a different way. In this instance, you're going to have stormwater. Is there a requirement in this development to have the sump pumps connected to the stormwater? That would help to alleviate some of the possibilities of drainage problems. So that's another point there. Density. Also, I guess, back to my neighbor's comments about garbage, the concern about having large bins being transported down to the end of the street for garbage and recycling, because we've worked very hard, having been here as long as I have, to reduce our garbage and have good recycling habits, I think, in our neighborhood. Having that follow through, not change because of this development, must be a priority for a green economy and a green environment. But we do not, having large sets of bins being brought down, so I think there should be a requirement that they have at the end of the driveway type of pickup done for each of the residences within the development, and you can enforce that onto the condo corporation and its requirements. I guess having a confirmation, given that the comments from the fire group, that there will be no on-street parking, because it's like blocking the fire lane in front of the grocery stores, right? Which unfortunately we see often. But we can't have that in here. If we had a fire and they wouldn't be able to get to it, that would be horrendous as it would spread. And that's, I guess the only other thing is, as we did before, when we went through the process with getting the 14 homes designated, there was a provision in that any of the zoning changes that were done relative to that approval were specific to that approval. So if, in the instance, this gets approved in some way, shape, or form, that the R3 zoning would be specific to only this plan, and so that there could be never an opportunity for somebody to come in, buy the property, and change the use of it because of the R3 designation. And that's all my comments for tonight. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So recognizing there may be others who wish to speak, I just wonder if we could just do, I know, Karen, I don't know if you're prepared to speak to the drainage questions and the lack of stormwater infrastructure in the area, but it would be helpful, I think, for council to better understand how stormwater is managed now, and where you would expect changes, challenges, more of the same.
Thank you, Your Worship. Sorry for my allergies. There are two stormwater ponds, actually with the drawing you see, there are two stormwater ponds, one adjacent to the center of the additional parking, as well as one closer to the east component for Jack Street. Jack Street, when it was built in 1997, did have a storm sewer component created for a stub, as well as sanitary and water for this development. This development didn't necessarily have as much land with it, but it is a requirement for stormwater as part of their submissions that the pre equals post development. So in other words, what there was runoff previous to this development, that is the allowable runoff afterwards. So they're required to retain and slow down and clean to an 80% total suspended solids value to that Jack Street. So yes, it is a urban development, which is not necessarily what all the streets in this corridor look like. This will be the full curb and gutter style development. The idea of sump pumps, I cannot speak specifically to that. They will have sump pumps in accordance with the Ontario Building Code, but it's the hydraulic grade line of the individual storm sewers that will run down the private road that will dictate that. And that will be identified in the stormwater report how they will be handled. Will they be coming to the front? Will they be coming to the back? Or will they connect direct to the storm sewer? I tried to find the stormwater report quickly while Mr. Murray was speaking, but I couldn't find it. So the idea is no post-development flows are to increase to the pre-development of the lands itself. There are stormwater facilities and snow storage identified off the private road on soft development, so on grassed areas.
Yes, please, Councillor Barclay.
Yeah, I'd just like to follow up on what Director Dunlop has shared as far as stormwater. But to Mr. Moray and his concerns about the future, he should know and the public should know that for the first time we are conducting a stormwater master plan process. Now this is long-term, it won't be complete probably until next year, but it'll look at gaps within the urban service area in terms of stormwater. So that's the first step in a long process to identify where the pain points are, and hopefully we can start addressing those.
Okay. In terms of waste management, do you want to speak to how confident you are that it would be managed well, or?
Yeah, certainly, Your Worship. The municipality of North Grenville has a waste management bylaw, and that waste management bylaw does give certain provisions for private roads. There is a maximum of 10 units available at Jack and Joseph based on this development. Then the residents can also participate in our Blue Box and Green Bin program. Should they have a private collector, then the private collector can go down the road. We haven't got down that far enough in that development to say, hey, it's going to be private, or hey, it's going to be public. But if it's public, it is required to be in compliance with our waste management bylaw. And they would still have to do tagged waste, recycle, and green bin.
And just going back to stormwater drainage, in terms of sump pumps and the dramatic weather event last week, I'm just curious about sort of volumes of water being collected and then dispersed by sump pumps. Is that contemplated in sort of the drainage considerations?
The storm, through you, Your Worship, the stormwater management report will identify certain storm events and percolations. The saving grace is newer homes have less filtering through. You know, they have less leaks. They have better systems. The water event or the weather event that we had last week, the hydraulic overloading of sanitary sewers, of storm sewers, of sump outlets were typically, not in all instances, of course, but we're typically overloading sanitary laterals because a sump pump was hooked to a sanitary lateral, which then, of course, sends it to the sewage plant for treatment. So yes, it's considered within the development. They have to design to a certain specification, and that is something that Public Works specifically looks for.
Okay. Just, might I also ask, just in the spirit of talking about stormwater, the initial speaker spoke of her concerns about stormwater drainage because there's two developments at play, I guess one on either side of your property effectively? Gotcha. Okay. Right. So I know that obviously stormwater was a big issue in that initial application. So is there consideration given to the compounding effect of another subdivision? Karen?
Through you, Your Worship, the short answer is no and yes. First off, within this development itself, no, because they have to maintain the water within their own development. And then it will be processed, percolated into the ground and sent to Jack Street. 810 Victoria, which is the other property at the back of your home, was a different, sorry, a different beast. There's no storm sewers on Victoria. There are on Jack. So this type of development also does not have the same densities and confines, but we do ask for lot grading plans so that we can make sure that there's no off-site runoff.
Okay.
There's no negative impact based on common law drainage to your neighbors.
Okay. We appreciate you being here this evening, Karen, because I know you're suffering from very bad hay fever. So thank you for lending some insight. Okay. And alternatives to sod, just in terms of drainage, just curious about whether or not that's been contemplated in North Grenville before. Amy, can you speak to that?
I can't speak to specific developments per se, but I know more so maybe on the public works side, and Director Dunlop can correct me if I'm wrong, we've looked at maybe some alternatives, including hydroseeding in certain areas as a way of regenerating the lawns in certain areas.
As a way to better facilitate water absorption?
I can't really speak to the water absorption piece, but it's just an alternative method to, in past practice where I've worked previous, we've looked at other methods, especially when it comes to, say, like our stormwater management ponds, hydroseeding versus sodding versus other methods. So certainly it's a conversation we would have with the developer as to kind of the end game as to the reestablishment of the green space on the property.
Okay. Old growth trees was mentioned. What is the plan? Okay. And I'd be curious about the traffic considerations that were raised by the resident in terms of a proposed crosswalk. Is your traffic person here? Okay. Right. True. Fair enough. Fair enough. Thank you. Are there other members of the public who wish to speak? Okay. So I'm so sorry. I didn't see you in my peripheral vision. So thank you. And anyone else wishing to speak, please come closer to the mic, and then we'll hear again from other members. Thank you. And just first name and address.
Yeah, thank you, Your Worship and Council. Jesse Stewart, 213 Van Buren. Just like to take a minute to thank my neighbor Bob. He's always on point with the nuanced issues. I, for one, am still fighting that stormwater. I'm actually on the southern side of this development, and if council hasn't seen one yet, there is a watershed map that shows it runs from southwest to northeast. So if I'm still having issues, this is going to be a real issue for anyone that's going to be in this development. Because,
and you were having, could you just describe your issue?
Yeah, I still have seepage coming up through my foundation on Van Buren, so it's still very much a real issue.
And that seepage is happening because?
Well, ever since this my sump pump's been running, but ever since this last storm.
Oh, the dramatic weather event, the volume of water.
Yeah, to Councillor Barclay's point, if the storm master plan can be
Yes.
sorted before any other development in this town happens,
Right.
I'm all for it. We can do that and then revisit any other topics.
And have you experienced
Hypothetical
seepage in the
situation.
past?
Pardon me?
Have you experienced seepage in the past through your foundation?
Minimal,
Okay.
minimal, yeah. But, yeah, this one is.
Persistent?
Yeah, persistent.
Okay.
Anyways, again, good evening. Name is Jesse Stewart. For those who have not met directly, I'm a proud resident, born and raised here in North Grenville. And my wife and I happily moved back to Kemptville a few years ago, where we purchased our home on Van Buren Street, where we actually happen to have 40 years of family history. I'm not looking to use up much of your time. That's why I'm going to stick to my notes here. But we do appreciate your time this evening, hearing and, more importantly, hopefully listening to your residents' concerns pertaining to this proposed development and specifically the rezoning it would require. Like many of my neighbors, those who are here and those who could not make it, we moved into our neighborhood knowing full well the interior of our block would one day be developed. We also knew that the neighborhood was zoned R1. As such, the anticipated development was expected to be reasonable and in line with the existing neighborhood. As you know, initial plans called for 12, or as we saw, 14 homes, and this made sense to most. It can't be overstated. Important decisions were made with this information. People made massive financial commitments with this information, choosing where to live, where to raise a family, where to call home. The congestion this development would add to the area is not part of their equations. Does this matter to the elected council? I suspect it does. It is clear to us that this proposal is overzealous. However, you don't need to take my word for it. I would like to turn your attention to the comments made by the Director of Planning and Development, Amy Martin's own comments, and this is not a criticism but an observation, specifically related to the planning and impact analyses. And for anyone watching online or behind me, that was found on, there was over 170 pages, forgive me, I didn't print them all, but page 77 of the agenda is where I found this. Planning and impact analysis states, the following criteria is to be considered for residential infill and intensification within the residential designation. I'll jump to item B. The size and shape of the parcel of land on which the proposal is to be located and the ability of the site to accommodate the intensity of the proposed use. That last part is key. Forgive me, but watch for the logical fallacy in this response. The proposed development has been designed to maximize the density on the site. This response speaks nothing towards the location's ability to accommodate the intensity, and it only intensifies the concerns themselves that it cannot. To suggest otherwise is a false conclusion. Planning and impact analysis states, item C, the following criteria is to be considered. The supply of vacant land in the area which is already designated and or zoned for the proposed use. We're talking about townhomes, affordable housing. The response, vacant lands on the south side of Van Buren Street have also been rezoned to permit the development of townhouse units, 210 Van Buren, which is within approximately 100 meters of subject lands. Think about that. Not only does this show that the criteria is not being considered, this is a literal admission that such a proposal as this is redundant, is overreaching, and it's not even required if the goal is for more townhouses, i.e. more affordable housing, styled units in this area. Not only that, we just received a beautiful slideshow on how subsidized housing already exists not 100 meters from this proposed development. Our neighborhood is already proudly doing its part here. A separate point from this, one can't propose low-rise housing and 3 stories in the same slideshow without reconciling that. Those are not the same things. You can't gloss over the fact low-rise and 3-story are the same thing. That was never reconciled. And finally, I'd like to bring your attention to the impact on local traffic, and I'm glad someone's here to speak on this because I'm going to for sure. Recognizing that a transportation impact study was completed last year, it is imperative that we acknowledge this study was conducted prior to a full return to work for most sectors due to the pandemic. In fact, the statement, this traffic level is expected to have negligible impacts on traffic operations along Van Buren Street, I find nothing less than comical. Here is my lived reality. Several weeks ago, I was attempting to leave my driveway to go to work. I did not anticipate being there for long, so I didn't set a timer. But I can tell you this. There was a song that started playing. It was a song I liked. Then it ended. Commercial break started. And then it ended. That represents at least 3.5 minutes. Likely closer to 4. While this might not sound like a long time, I've brought a timer with me today to demonstrate before you, as I sit here, how long 3.5 minutes is.
Are you taking us all the way to 4 minutes?
I don't have to.
It might be helpful to carry on.
Fair enough.
Appreciate
Your worship,
the
I
pause.
totally can appreciate that. I can totally appreciate your interruption because you clearly understand and agree this is an exorbitant and unreasonable amount of time to sit and wait at work, as you are right now, let alone at the end of your driveway simply trying to get to work. Will 38 additional units improve this experience? This is not a gentle increase in density as the developer would like you to believe. We just heard a convoluted explanation of how people will even be housed in secondary dwellings and where they're going to park. If their garages are filled, is it really housing all their cars? 18 units per gross hectare is not only more reasonable, but meets the requirements of the official plan that you guys speak of. The plans put forward as they sit represent more than 3/4 of the maximum density. In fairness, it does astonish me that a councillor tonight even just asked if more units could be added. I've spoken with my neighbors. I've listened to them, as I hope you're doing tonight. During the open house with Q9 Planning in December, more than 1/4 of the public input comments were directly related to reducing the number of units proposed. When and where were these concerns addressed? Do you know how many inputs were made supporting the development? Exactly 0. This, despite the fact it was an open house for anyone and everyone to attend. No one showed up asking for this. These are your citizens, and they need you to represent them as they elected you to do, not the interests of an out-of-town developer. So, are you listening? I think you are. If so, and you haven't heard me speak the words, tell us, what words do you need to hear us speak to put an end to this proposal as it's presented? And that wasn't rhetorical. I appreciate that, but it wasn't rhetorical. Are there words we can say?
That's a really big question. So,
I'm sure it is.
The function of
I'm
this
hoping to
public
get an
meeting-
answer to that
For
question.
sure. And the function of this public meeting is to do a deep dive into where the concerns lay,
Fair.
to what extent they can be reconciled, to potentially make a decision or ask for more information.
I
So
appreciate that,
think
Your
that's what
Worship.
we're doing tonight.
I will end by saying this then. Please avoid falling into any kind of different logical fallacy, that of the sunk cost fallacy. Just because time and money has been spent on this proposal does not itself merit going forward with it. We recognize change is imminent in this plot of land. We simply ask that you insist on a reasonable number of houses filling the interior of our home and keep the zoning in place as we knew it to be. With that, I thank you, and if there's any time for questions that I can add in later, I will. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We appreciate it. I should have asked for your 4-minute pause so we could contemplate your question.
You want that 4-minute pause right now? I'll
It's
time it.
okay. It's okay. We're going to hear from, I think, 2 other members of the public, and then we'll take a brief pause. It's been a long evening. I think council colleagues need to stretch their legs, and then we'll regroup. So thank you, Jesse, very much. Just name and address for the public record. Thanks.
Yes.
Thank you very much for the opportunity. Glenneberg, I'm at 315, so I'm one of the properties that's most impacted, especially by the visitor parking that will be outside my kitchen window. Very, very close to my house. I'm a single woman. I don't really care for transient people being that close to the property. But when I bought, and I was given plans for 9 homes. So I bought and I invested in Kempville based on knowing there was going to be 9 homes. 9 homes is reasonable. I didn't buy in Barrhaven because I didn't want to live in Barrhaven. I work in Barrhaven. I don't want to live there. We have a great community. Some of my concerns, I actually spoke to the gentleman who I believe owns the land. He came out to visit because he had received my concerns about the fencing. He acknowledged that the fencing was totally reasonable on the side with the visitor parking, which I was greatly relieved. I would like to see the entire development fenced in because I'll have people literally in my backyard because as you can see where my property ends, the houses immediately start. You're putting 36, 38 homes in the middle of a subdivision, an area that has 22 around it. So the density is going to be greater in the center. I know the people that made all these great plans and reports on traffic and snow removal and everything else. If you live in the area and you see during a realistic snowstorm, the snow removal, which is stellar on my street, I can tell you that, but a narrower road with some of the snowfalls we've had, where in the hell is that snow going to go? Like realistically, honestly, when it comes to the waste removal, I honestly think you have to have something firmly in place for the removal of people's garbage set out. I know I don't want to see a bunch of bins in front of my house. That's not why I bought in that neighborhood. I bought because it was a beautiful, old, established neighborhood. One of my concerns, the stone foundation. Almost all of my neighbors have stone foundations. There's going to be tremendous disturbance with the digging, and I want to know who do I call when I have a problem. I want a name when this development starts. Who do I call? Because I do not have resources to fight the big powers that be for getting what I deserve, which is protection of the home that I bought. You know, we wouldn't be here fighting and speaking if we didn't love the community that we lived in. But I honestly so regret if I had known that people could change the plans that they give you when you put money in and you invest in a community, and all of a sudden, you know, this is the 3rd time I've been here speaking about what's going in the backyard because it's changed from what I was told. And maybe that's just me being a naive first homeowner, just not knowing you can't trust people. But that's kind of how, you know, we knew something would go up, but it's the density that really is tremendously bothering. So, and I appreciate you taking the time to listen. Thank you.
Thank you. Just name and address for the record.
Yes, good evening, everyone. My name is Catherine Parent. I live at 232 Aces Street, and I've been here before. For my great neighbors in the back, they will know from different conversations and from seeing some changes in our home that we were very involved in the development on Jack Street. And so I have a cautionary story or tale to share because The issues that we had on Jack Street were never about, and nor are they now, about development. They are about proper development. We welcomed Jack Street. We were excited that the Association for Community Living was going to run it. We were excited that Lockwood was going to be building, and we were concerned about certain issues that are repeated again tonight. We were concerned about traffic. We were concerned about delineation. We were concerned about light pollution. We were concerned about garbage. We were concerned about snow removal, all of these things. I had members of this council sitting in my backyard who understood finally, after many correspondence, that they had made a mistake and that they should have impressed upon the builder to build a fence to make the delineation between our properties appropriate and visible. Nobody was able to give us any sort of solution. We had to put out money, over $12,000, to build a privacy fence on one part of our property. We fought back and said, because council had said that they were going to push for this, and I got an email to say that the developer would plant some privacy bushes or trees or something of that line. That never even happened. We had to build a fence to keep the view of someone else's garbage, all those units of garbage, away from our house. We still now have all of those units from a private lane. All of that snow from their parking area has been put onto our neighbor's property and onto their property and not been removed. We've addressed that with council. There's snow, and not from any crazy storm, but just regular accumulation and not being taken away, is over their roof line. So where their gutters are, where their, help me out here. Thank you, eavesdrops are. That is where their snow is. That's how big the pile of snow is. So I'm telling you and I'm warning you that you should not take this lightly, and you should realize you can say no, and you can make sure that you're not making the same mistake twice. Because I, like many of my neighbors behind me, live in an old home, one of those original stone homes, or brick and stone homes, and we have flooding where we've never had before, because our neighbors on Jack Street have an elevated property that didn't exist before. So now we have the lower part of the property. We have all of that runoff, all of that snow removal, and again, all of those trees that we thought were going to stay because council suggested that they should. They all disappeared. All of these things that I'm hearing my neighbors say, I've heard them say before. And I've been told that council was not able to make the decisions that they wanted to make because it was in someone else's hand, because you came through it halfway of the deal. Now you're here at the beginning of the deal, and I really ask that you listen to your constituents and you don't make the same mistake twice. They're concerned with good reason for traffic. There are tons of kids. We're the demographic that you want in this community. We have those young kids. We put additions on our homes because we're not buying at the top of our budget. We are not against development. We are against poor urban planning. And when you have this private road with this number of units, there are obviously concerns. And you don't have to say yes to these builders. And I applaud my neighbors for standing up for what they believe in, and I encourage you to remember the conversations on Jack Street and the developments there. Again, never concerned about having neighbors on Jack Street. And we had fewer neighbors. This type of intense densification, and I'd like to applaud Jesse, 3 stories, that's not within coming of this neighborhood. Your neighbors, your constituents are not against development, but they are against this. And I hope you remember when you're talking to them and making decisions in the future, some of those things that you said on Jack Street that didn't come to fruition, remember them now and maybe do good on it now. Because, I mean, we've already built our fence. We're going to be dealing with that snow continuously. Thank God I don't have to look at their garbage removal anymore, or a call about a mattress that was left out for weeks. And I do appreciate it, Karen, that you took care of that for me. But again, we don't want to police our neighbors, and we don't want to have to deal with 4 minutes getting out of our driveway. And I don't think we as a community want what this is going to look like in reality. Thank you.
Okay. Is there anyone else wishing to speak? Yeah. Yes, sure. Yep. Come on down.
For the courtesy of anyone listening at home, this is Samantha Levitt from 305 Joseph Street.
Thank you.
I just
got
wanted
the routine down. I applaud it.
I just wanted to make a point of clarification because you did ask one of my neighbors about the groundwater that they are already having issues with. We consistently get groundwater in our basement with any major snow melts or rainstorms, not just the severe event that we had recently, and that is true for our neighbors across the street on Victoria as well. And we are unable to get a sump pump actually in our house. The contractor that we got just said that it wouldn't make sense for the type of build that we have. So that just to add a layer of impression on why the stormwater is so important to me personally.
And you have an older foundation?
Yes, my house is 110 years old.
Ah, so you have one of the, originals. Okay, thank you. Okay, council, it's 9 o'clock. Should we take a brief break and then we'll come back and ask the applicant some questions that have yet to be resolved? So we'll just take 10 minutes. Thank you. Okay, we're going to resume our public meeting. We are still in the public meeting portion of the meeting. I'm just going to confirm that there were no other members of the public who wish to speak. I don't see anybody. Okay, scanning the room. With that in mind, then we'll ask the applicant and the applicant's team to come down, and perhaps you can address some of the questions you believe you've heard, and then we'll supplement if we think you've missed anything. Thank you.
So hello again to everyone. I was told not everyone could hear me last time, so I will try as best I can to speak closer to the mic. So we were listening intently, and I did make sure to write down all the comments that we heard. So we do have some comments to provide back. I'll start with my own comments, and then I will lead into the other members with us to speak to the other items. So in terms of the setbacks and fitting within the neighborhood and the density, proposing this as a development of single detached units wouldn't be consistent with current policy, in accordance also with the housing crisis that we have right now. We do want to see that housing intensification and the various unit types. There are a lot of single detached units generally. I know there has been newer development that is proposing different residential types, but there is not policy support to have, a large site like this be majority singles. We do want to provide that medium density in accordance with policy to have those various price points as the primary units and also as secondary dwelling units where they can be accommodated. In terms of the setbacks that we're seeking, other than the one pinch point of Unit C on the north block, kind of the third block in, all the other setbacks are consistent with the R3 zone at 7.5 or greater in certain circumstances. So if you look at the two blocks to the southwest, you'll notice there's 10-meter setbacks in those areas and 7.5 generally everywhere else, as well as the front yard setbacks being generally 6 meters, except for one or two areas where it's pinched. But as I noted, there are a majority is in conformance with that R3 zone, which speaks to the suitability of this land area to accommodate that density. We are less than the maximum density for the neighborhood policy area for this one. So no official plan amendment was required for the density that's being proposed. So that does speak to the compatibility of the proposed units for the land area that it's in. And we were hearing, the comments, significant comments about stormwater management. The consultant that was retained for this development has worked in the North Grenville, Kemptville area. They are familiar with, the systems and how it all works and ties together. There is the stormwater connection on Jack Street. I did take a look at the report while we were waiting to speak again, and it is noted that the post-development flows are actually going to be better than pre-development flows for this development, taking into consideration the storm ponds and the connection into Jack Street. So we are going to be looking at a better situation in terms of stormwater management for this development. So there will not be any stormwater overflowing into neighboring properties. And then there was also the comment about fencing. So the owner of the property did meet with the owner who raised the issue of fencing, and they are agreeable to providing that fencing around the parking that is closest to Joseph Street at the west end. In terms of the alternative to sod, it's not something we're in disagreement with or have an issue with, but at the end of the day, whether an alternative option is continued on by the future owners, that's not something I don't think can really be prescribed. We're here to discuss the zoning bylaw itself. Getting into the details of the subdivision conditions can look at additional forms of landscaping. I'm not sure to what extent it can require alternative, I guess, greenscaping for the amenity yards. Depending on what people are using them for, they may choose to landscape it, whatever best suits their lifestyle. Just looking at my notes. We did receive the comments about foundation disruption during construction. So construction management practices will be in place whenever the development gets underway. And, you know, we want to set up that open line of communication to whoever is the construction manager on site with either staff or counselors and the residents to facilitate any ongoing, you know, concerns or comments as construction takes place. Just going through the comment with regards to low rise and 2 to 3 stories. So an R1 zone in a lot of instances can go up to 3 stories, and in zoning and policy terms and planning terms, 1 to 4 is sort of 1 to 4 stories, is the kind of understanding of what's considered to be low rise. A 4-story apartment building is generally considered to be a low rise type of development. And the location of those, the 3-story options, I'm actually going to invite Mr. Ralph Vandenberg up to sort of discuss, you know, where they're sited on the lot and how that fits into the neighborhood as a whole.
Before you go, you spoke of the stormwater system improving, right?
That's correct.
Improving stormwater management in the area? So I'm hearing you correctly, because I'm trying to do the math. Help me. Articulate that in a different way so I can better understand what you mean.
If I may, Madam Mayor, I will read directly from the summary.
Sure. Yep.
If that's helpful.
Yes, go ahead.
So it states in the report from Collards, the use of a storm sewer network and subsurface stormwater storage tanks will allow for temporary detention of stormwater runoff within the site such that peak post-development flow rates are less than peak pre-development flow rates for design storms up to and including a 100-year event.
Okay. So I'm making sense of that. So there's no development there now. It's a field.
Correct.
Their assertion is storm water flow, right?
Runoff from the site.
It would be higher with a fallow field, effectively, than it is with a stormwater management in 34 homes.
That's correct. They are developing a system in place to improve the management of stormwater than what currently exists. And through you, Madam Mayor, Councillor Dunlop seems very well versed in this area as well. I don't know if she has additional
Director.
comment.
She's a director. Yes, not councillor, but very seasoned nonetheless.
Apologies.
Very seasoned. Would you like to run for office, Director Dunlop?
Apologies.
No. Okay. Yes, indeed. So I don't know if you have a further comment on it.
No, I just think that for clarity from, is that the idea is that the outlet at Jack Street will have less flow than basically the runoff of the existing site. So yes, there's a lot more hard surfaces. There's the percolation ponds at 2 locations. There are 3 locations for snow, and should the snow exceed, we'll make sure it's included in any agreement that they haul off site, rather than having what Kathy said in regards to her rear fence, which I will follow up with that property owner. So that is the intent, is that the runoff with the ponds and the pipe itself will improve even though there's more hard surface.
Yeah, okay. I just wanted it on the record so I better understood those calculations because I was struggling, so that's very helpful. Thank you. We're seeing a question from the back, Jesse?
Yeah, sorry, just the definition of low rise, it might be 1 to 4 stories, but it was used to justify the continuity with 1.5 to 2 stories that are pre-existing in the neighborhood. So to me, the definition of 1, 3, 4, 10 doesn't really matter. It's justified being continuous with the pre-existing neighborhood.
And you're speaking to the number of stories of certain housing units. Okay, perfect. We can get back to that for sure. So you were going to pass it over to your colleague. Okay.
Yeah, my name is Ralph Vandenberg from Vandenberg and Wildeboer Architects. So we kind of developed that plan working with the rest of the team. So I can just speak just briefly, if I can, just about the footprint of the various units that you see there. And you notice there are basically 4 types, A, B, C, and D, and they're all of different sizes. And in terms of the accessory dwellings, there's 7, like we talked about before, and those are those footprints are the ones that have the larger footprint on the property. So you see the D units, for instance, on the northwest corner, they're deeper units. The semis on Jack Street are the deeper units. There's 3 C units you'll see on the north side. Those have a bigger footprint. And that's to enable that accessory dwelling to happen down in the basement. So that's why they have a bigger footprint size. But most of the units are the A units that you'll see. In fact, there's 22 of them. And the square footage that you can get out of a 2-story building with that footprint is 1,302 square feet. So we're talking about modest townhouse units. And this goes to speak to...
and that's the primary unit, not the secondary dwelling unit?
Yeah, that's the primary
So
unit.
The
It's
square footage of
1,302.
the
Yeah.
main unit is 1,300 square feet?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. The additional unit would be down in the lower level in the basement.
Indeed.
Yeah.
With a much
So-
less square footage, clearly. So the
Yes.
proposed secondary units are what, 600 square feet? Like, what's the?
Well, that's a good question. It's around there, and you can see if you look at the A unit, the most popular one, of which we have 22, the X that's shown there, that's the garage footprint. So you have to imagine trying to do a separate dwelling unit in the basement of a footprint that size. You just can't do it. You need room for a furnace and a washroom and a kit, everything that goes along with a unit there. So my point being, the 1,302 square feet for those 22 units, that's a very affordable target for a townhouse. Most townhouses are considerably larger than that in the marketplace. And so this is really targeting, again, it just goes to that affordability target that we're trying to hit.
But would you also agree that just given the limited amount of land, to make those units notably larger would really confine your ability to build the number that are there, that you're proposing now, right? Like, it's a fairly limited parcel of land you're working with, correct?
Yeah, it really is, not just the geometry, but the depth of it.
Right.
In order to get basically 2 rows of townhouses facing each other with a street in the middle,
Right.
it's very confining,
Yeah.
very limiting, yes.
Okay.
But the beauty of that is that it offers the opportunity to provide affordable units.
Indeed.
Yeah.
I mean, there are many different definitions of affordable, and as you can
Yes.
see from presentations earlier this evening, we're really trying to get our heads around what is affordable, especially when you're looking at a purchase
Yes.
of a home versus obviously rental units. I mean, I would also suggest that if these secondary units become selling features of these homes, which I presume increase their value, they also increase potentially the accessibility of those homes because people could likely have a second source of income to finance, right, the
Yes.
purchasing of the unit. But
Yes.
they also add to the value of the home, which is, I would
Sure,
expect
yeah.
that they would
Yeah.
add value to the home. Right.
Yeah, and a finished basement in
Right.
anybody's
Yeah.
home would also do that.
Yeah.
Right, so, yes.
Indeed. Okay.
Yeah.
Yes, Councillor Barclay.
Yes, through you, Madam Mayor. You've pointed out that the 7 additional units would be in units D and C. I made a comment earlier, would you be able to entertain 2 more additional units? And I understand from what you've just said is that only the C models and the D models could accommodate those kinds of units. And I understand that in terms of having a large enough space in the basement to have a reasonable apartment. My question is, on the far left-hand side, the 2D units, what is to prevent you making the 2A units into D units? I think you've got room at the rear and at the head to expand the footprint of those 2 units. So, one of the things I would ask again, could you entertain creating 2 more D units right beside those 2 D units and being able to provide 2 more additional units?
We can certainly look into that to see if we can do it. I mean, there's 2 other locations that might work, but we're trying to balance a lot of things. For instance, the A unit and the B unit that are on either side of where the stormwater management is, and where the visitor parking is. We could do a special unit, try to do a bump out there, but we're kind of fighting against the stormwater, make sure there's enough of volume of space for those tanks to work properly and the grades to work. So we can certainly see if we can make that work. The challenge with the 2 A's that you talked about is that it starts to affect the streetscape a little bit, you know, in terms of what that looks like as you drive along that private road. But physically, it might be possible.
Yeah, I'm sorry to get into the how of
Right.
the question, but
Yes.
I'll leave it up to you to figure out what's the best way to go forward.
Yeah.
Because we do have a target that we're trying to hit.
Okay, so let's just try to get through the other areas where perhaps questions have not yet been answered or need more information. I know traffic, right, was an issue, so perhaps someone can speak to that.
Yes, Madam Mayor, I was sort of leaving that to the end.
Yeah.
I know it's a major issue,
Okay.
so I'll
Do
invite
you have
Gord
other
up
points to complete, or is this the time for traffic?
I can switch it over to traffic, and then
Perfect.
perhaps when they're done, I can provide just sort of a summary
Sure.
comment at the end, if that's.
And Jesse, I'm just recognizing you. If you wish to come down and speak again in a more formal way, you can do that once we've completed our round. Maybe that makes more sense. That way you can be on the record and you can be heard. Okay, so over to the traffic. Yeah, Councilor Strachan, sorry.
We may not want to move on to traffic quite yet, I'm not sure. So I guess one of the lingering questions that we have through you, Madam Mayor, is, we went from a plan that had 14 single detached dwellings to 34 semi-detached and townhomes. It's obvious there's math that's involved in there, 34 units versus 14 units, and the affordability aspect of it. But is there an answer that can be provided as to what is driving that big change from 14 to 34 units?
So through you, Madam Mayor, there's a number of factors that are feeding into that. Obviously, economics of development always comes into play. It's not simply a matter of a developer wants to make excess amount of money, but they need to show a certain amount of profit. Otherwise, banks and insurance will not back them for a development, and then something will not get constructed. There's also the moving target of construction costs and creating that buffer. So you want to meet a certain, obviously economic balance. On the other hand, we're also seeing a housing crisis, and we understand that we need to provide density that fits, and we did look at this carefully. We looked at the policies in place. We made sure that the setbacks on the whole, with the exception of the one pinpoint, are compliant with the R3 zone. So we look at this from a number of different angles, trying to balance all of the different competing factors that you typically have in any one development. And this is the proposal that fits best with all of those aspects.
So there isn't a particular area per se that gets you from 14 to 34, right? That forces that, that big jump in the number of houses that would be the reason behind that kind of change.
I'm going to defer to the owner, Mr. Wayne Webster.
Yes, I'm Wayne Webster. I'm the one guilty for all this controversy, I guess. I looked at my notes today, and I just said, when did I get involved in this? It was 2011. That was my first, July 2011. It's 12 years ago. And at that time, I was told that there was a proposal for duplexes or semi-detached. 28 was the number that I was given. So I went to 28, and whether it was the neighbors that did at the time, but then they went. There was an attempt to make it something bigger than that, but 20 that had been made, and they said no, they'll back it off to 28, and so I'm not just sure what happened to bring it down to 14, but I was not involved. I had a partner that was. And he said, well, listen, you can make as much profit on 14 as you can 28, 14 singles. Well, sorry, that's not the case. There's a lot of rock excavation there that brought the, we did, I backed it down to 14, and the rock excavation just blew the availability out of the water. So I guess certainly there's some that have been here for longer than, around for longer than the 12 years I have, and they come in with low numbers. I come in with a high number, and so that's kind of the where I'm at. I thought I should answer that rather than someone else, because I have some history too.
Thank you.
Okay, Council, are we ready to talk about traffic? And then we'll return to any outstanding questions and any other comments from the public. All right, welcome.
Hi there. I'm Gord Scobie. I'm a transportation engineer with JL Richards and Associates. So we were commissioned to do a traffic impact study, and that involved visiting the site during peak hours. We went multiple days and recorded a number of observations. Using that traffic information, we established baseline conditions using capacity analysis software. And doing that, we didn't find any capacity issues at the time. The counts were collected last year, it's in September 2022. And yeah, during our observations, we didn't see any prevailing safety issues. And then the next step of the traffic study is to develop projected traffic volumes. So with that, we use previous studies, which are compiled in a large book called the Institute of Transportation Engineers Trip Generation Manual. And development of this size and nature generally will generate roughly 25 vehicles in the peak hour. I understand there's more units than there are trips being generated. This is attributed to people work different hours of the day. They have different jobs. There's working from home, that sort of thing. So with this traffic, we then add it to our baseline conditions, run it through the software, and again, we didn't find any capacity constraints. So from a transportation perspective, we don't see any issues with the site. In terms of cut-through traffic, the private road doesn't really provide a parallel route to Victoria Street or Van Buren, not for any great distance. Speeding shouldn't be an issue. It's a narrow street. It's curvilinear. In terms of required traffic calming, we don't think there is a need at this stage, but post-development, if there is evidence that there is issues with speeding or safety issues, traffic calming can easily be implemented post-development. Not sure if that addresses all the questions, but that was basically the process of doing a traffic impact assessment.
In the suggestion of a crosswalk, which was internal to the development or as they come out? Okay.
Just because we have a significant number of dog walkers, but also children waiting for school buses and things like that,
Okay, sure. Was that given any consideration, how one would leave? I know traffic studies sometimes focus on the internal movement within the proposed subdivision versus the sort of wider impact. So was there any consideration given to crosswalks in particular?
Given the level of traffic the site's
Yeah.
expected to generate, bid block pedestrian crossings weren't warranted.
Okay. And I'm assuming that's because the number of, I'm trying to translate for you. So what I think I'm hearing is that the number of units, in your view, didn't have a disproportionate effect on traffic flow or traffic activity in the area. Is that correct?
Correct.
Okay, so to that end, you didn't contemplate these other options, such as a crosswalk, correct?
Correct.
Okay. Of course, is it at the municipality's discretion to consider things like crosswalks?
The municipality has different policies, as well as we use standard guidelines for the installation of crosswalks, because if you install one where it's not warranted, it can actually be more of a safety hazard than if you than when you make sure you install it. The other thing to consider is that the Joseph Street sidewalks are on the east side of the road, which is the side of the development. So people walking north and south can use the sidewalks to get into this development, and so the crosswalk would not be warranted. It would be an exceptionally low PXO should it be warranted.
Okay. Colleagues, anything else on the traffic side that we wanted to address tonight? Not seeing anything? Okay. Okay, great. All right. The existence of old growth trees, butternut, I think butternut trees was mentioned.
The environmentalists that we had retained at the beginning, they did do an on-site visit and did not identify any issues. So I am not someone who would be able to say whether there's a butternut tree or not. As we get into subdivision conditions, we can also follow up on that, and they can potentially look at the site again in the spring. So I can kind of work through that with Ms. Martin as we go through subdivision conditions. But in terms of, what's on the site now, there is going to be, grading that needs to take place, storm ponds, the development, the construction. So it's not expected that the current vegetation will remain on the site as is, but there is the proposal to plant a significant number of new trees for the site.
Okay. In fencing, I understand that there's an agreement to fence in the proposed parking lot?
Correct. There is an agreement to provide fencing on the west side for the south side of the visitor parking.
Okay, and is that what the resident was asking? I'm sorry, I forget your name. Yes. Yes, I remember. So were you asking for fencing of the entire parking area? Yeah. Right.
So I was seeking, and I would like it to be totally fenced in.
Okay.
I'm very impacted by, it's not like some of the other homes that their end of their backyard butts up to the butt end of the
Yes. Okay.
I'm just trying to be reasonable and asking for.
Okay. And has that request for more fencing been entertained?
To my understanding, the agreement at this point is to have the fencing around the visitor parking. I'm not certain about the continuation of it around the rear of the women's property.
Okay.
But we can certainly look at additional fencing details through the subdivision agreement and figuring out, where it makes sense to do that.
Okay, so I'll just go to council colleagues. Is there anything else you want answered? I can see a couple of members of the public wanting to jump back in, so we can invite them to do that formally at the mic before concluding the public meeting. But just colleagues, is there anything else you need before I go to members of the public? Councillor Barclay?
Yeah, this is a zoning bylaw amendment meeting, and I, through you, Madam Mayor, to Director Martin, what would the holding symbol, if we approve this to a third density exception, what would the holding symbol allow us to do, if anything?
So the holding symbol would not allow development on the property until such time that a subdivision agreement is executed. And there's specific conditions within the zoning bylaw amendment itself that also includes provisions that the affordable housing matter is also addressed.
That being said, we did receive some comments about the degree to which the holding symbol bound this development to the specifics of the proposed affordable secondary dwelling unit. So I don't know if that language, in your view, is strong enough to give council confidence that those additional dwelling units will serve the function as articulated, right? When it comes to the affordable housing provisions we're asking every developer to comply with.
Thank you, Your Worship. The wording is very similar to wording we've used in more recent zoning bylaw amendments, 215 Rubin Street, in regards to the Pine Hill Road rezoning we did in December of last year. We've been utilizing the same language to ensure that before a holding zone can be lifted on the property, whether it's through a site plan agreement for certain developments, or in this case, a subdivision agreement, that is adequately addressed, and council will be made aware of what those provisions are. And then just as a reminder, the draft conditions in regards to the plan of subdivision are required to have council approval, and that is another mechanism in which we would address the affordable housing piece as well.
Okay, thanks. Councillor Barclay, so I've received, right, sort of a different understanding of the strength of the holding symbol, but I certainly accept, Ms. Martin, that obviously we've used that language in the past. Should it be strengthened is probably a conversation for another day at this point, but I just wanted to flag it. Councillor Barclay, Deputy Mayor?
Yeah, just to follow up on my earlier question through you, Madam Mayor, to Director Martin. So a lot of the issues that have been presented here would be handled through a site plan agreement after the zoning has been changed. Is that my understanding? And then I've got a final question.
So the zoning in principle, should it be passed by council, would establish the residential third density use with the site exceptions. Development wouldn't occur until the holding zone's been addressed, which is through that subdivision agreement, which is where the municipality provides the terms and conditions for the development itself, including matters as civil engineering, which would include stormwater, affordable housing, fencing requirements, covenants. There's a lot that goes into the agreement that
Right.
then the developer has to construct their development to.
Thanks. So in other words, yes, a lot of that's been raised tonight isn't really germane to the bylaw amendment that's on the table right now. The only thing that's really germane is that we would permit construction of 34 townhouses and 2 semi-detached units. That's it. So if we're looking at reducing the density, we would defer or not approve. In other words, if for some reason we decided that some of these problems could be alleviated, and I don't want the owners to have a heart attack right now. I understand your investment, and you've got a right to get a return on that investment. But if through some mechanism we decided we wanted 30, approve 30 units and 2 semi-detached, we would have to not approve this and ask them to come back with a new application. Is that
I
correct?
assume it could be deferred for further consideration, correct?
That is correct, Your Worship,
Yeah.
and something that we can
Right.
go back with the developers and discuss the comments received tonight.
Yeah.
That's typical standard practice and council provides that direction as to if there's certain specifics you'd like us to take a look at prior to bringing it back for further consideration, as well as the timeline as to when it's to be brought back for council's consideration.
Okay. Okay, so I'm just, because we are still in the public meeting phase, members of the public who wish to have one more opportunity to express concerns, please do so now, and then I'm moving to close the public meeting, and we'll consider the staff recommendation. Council actually has a curfew. We have a mandated curfew to not meet beyond 10:30 without a specific motion allowing us to go beyond that. I don't think that's necessary, but I just want you to know we're very cognizant of time, all of your time, staff's time, the applicant's time, and our own time. So, and we have another matter to consider. So.
Robert Moray, just for the record, and curfews, I haven't had to use that since my daughter was growing up. So
Welcome, welcome to council.
Yeah.
Welcome.
Just a quick point. On slide 11, of the Planning Department's presentation entitled Site Development. Bullet point 5 says fences will be required to provide additional privacy to existing neighbors. So is that the whole development or just what has been specifically discussed?
Through your worship to Mr. Murray, so there's been certain elements that have been discussed that have come through emails with Ms. Burke in regard to her property, but it's certainly something that staff can take back with the developer for consideration for additional fencing with with the majority of the property lines.
Sure.
And sorry, in the strange world that we often live in, we've also seen scenarios where you have one resident who wants a fence, one resident who wants a hedge, and we try to create some consistency. But certainly we'll take that feedback and work with the developers to address that landscaping and buffering.
I was just speaking to the bullet, so I just wanted to make sure I wasn't misinterpreting.
Sure. Yeah, it's a fair question.
Yeah.
Yep.
So.
Okay.
And it's all about pause, breathe, and relax.
I think it's pause, breathe, unwind. It was unwind.
I like relax.
Okay.
But you're right.
Okay, so last comments from the public, please. Jesse, want to come back? Sean, do you wish to speak as well? Okay.
Pause, breathe, unwind. Okay. All right. Jesse again, 213 Van Buren. Thank you, council. Obviously, we've been running a little bit late because it is passionate to obviously many members of the community. I just wanted to first say thank you for opening the topic of deferment. We really appreciate that because what we've heard basically so far from those proposing this is thanks for your thoughts, but your concerns are unwarranted. And it just really sounds like nothing's really being digested and everything is just trying to be pushed through. So thank you for the topic of deferment. Just a couple comments or questions here. It was mentioned that Kemptville is an aging population. Were this to go ahead or any version of it, how many of these units would adequately service the elderly? Perfect examples usually are bungalows or anything that are one level. Obviously, when we're talking about 2 or 3 stories, I'm not so sure if that would fit the bill. So it's something worth considering how that might service our aging population. Just a point of contention I kind of noticed, we're here to debate the zoning to see if this was even feasible or reasonable or whatnot acceptable to the community. Is it or was it appropriate for council to suggest even increasing the plan when the residents' concerns about rezoning to R3 haven't even yet been addressed? I found that a little disconcerting to consider, can we add to this when a lot of the members of the community have spoken up about minimizing? A side point for myself, if something like this were to go through, I have a fun story. The house I live in actually used to be the original Van Buren farm. One of the original horse barns is still on my property. If this were to go through, can I just turn my barn into a triplex with no pushback? I doubt it. I don't think council would be approving of that. But it would be fitting to the mantra here of just jamming as many people as possible into an elderly or an older community. There was a point sorry, Councillor, forgive me, Strackerian, I like that. You had asked the question, why the charge towards 38 units? The answer was not money, but profitability. Think about that for a second. Again, you guys are not obliged to push through with something like that. That's a very tautological response. With that, I'll just say thank you and good night. I appreciate your time and staying so late tonight.
You're the first person who's used the word tautological in a delegation or intervention with council, so congratulations. All right, Sean, please come forward before we wrap up the public meeting.
Good evening, Sean Yakimovich. I live at 206 Van Buren Street. I had a question for Mr. Sweeney, if that was
Sure.
okay.
Yeah.
Were you retained for a traffic study for the 210 Van Buren project? Your firm? No. Okay. So I just had concerns about whether the two developments of the traffic studies kind of talk to each other, because one may conclude this project's okay, the other one concludes the other project's okay, but living in the middle of all of this, is anybody doing the math on?
Right. So cumulative impact.
That's right.
Okay.
So that's just a question, because traffic is probably my main concern from both of these, and
Right.
I think Jesse was pretty eloquent in outlining the concerns there, and backing out of my driveway is already a
nightmare.
problem.
Yeah.
I only see that getting worse.
Right.
So.
Understood. Okay.
Well, it depends on time of day, but but just one lived experience within the last 2 weeks. My daughter was crossing Van Buren Street, looked both ways, coast was clear. Before she can complete the crossing, there was a car honking at her in her lane. So probably coming off Joseph Street, I wasn't there to witness this, but turning onto Van Buren, where everybody speeds and hits the gas, you know, having to brake and honk. So this is the first instance of you know, this kind of near miss, and my concern is that that'll get worse.
Yep. Well, Van Buren's already very busy. So, and you're specifically focused on the impact on Van Buren, correct?
Yes.
Right.
Yeah, but of course, you know, the side streets will be
Yep.
impacted as well. So.
Indeed. But we know there's much more traffic volume currently on Van Buren, so, and so can I just ask the traffic consultant briefly, do you contemplate other developments that are in play when you look at the impact of a particular development? Are you sort of doing a 360 of what else might be happening in the neighborhood?
Yes, we usually take those into consideration, but we weren't made aware of this other.
Okay. Okay.
So depending which one came first, usually the other one has to consider.
Gotcha. Okay. So it would be helpful, I think, for us to have that information about whether or not you were, whether or not you in fact did consider this other development in your analysis. Because if you didn't, it might be helpful to do so as a secondary
So I did not,
analysis.
but the other traffic impact assessment
May or may not have. I see.
included
Okay. So that's something that, Ms. Martin, I'm sure you could provide further clarification on, is whether or not the traffic studies talk to each other? Okay. For the two prospective developments. Okay.
All right, thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Okay. So I don't see other public comments from members of our community. And if that's the case, then I'm going to close the public meeting. And we'll move to a motion. As mentioned, council, the staff recommendation is to proceed with the rezoning. However, a deferral is equally an option, as is a denial of the application. So I'll just recognize Councillor Sullivan. Yes, Councillor Sullivan?
Thank you, Madam Mayor. So if we choose to defer this, at what point could we get specific questions answered and then bring it back so that that the developers are not left hanging for an unnecessary amount of time?
Ms. Martin?
Through your worship, that's up to council to provide a timeline to staff when they would like it to return. If you're asking me personally as to a timeline that you think that staff would need to review, a month or two should be adequate. We could bring it back at our May meeting to try and address some of the questions that have been raised, or we could push it out to June to allow for some additional time.
Ms. Dunlop, are you? I think our preference would be June to give you enough runway, as there's no sense bringing it back if some questions remain unanswered. Yep.
Thank you, Your Worship. So there are planning meetings scheduled for May the 10th and June the 14th.
Okay.
So if that is the intent, June 14th would be the day.
Okay. Okay, Councillor O'Sullivan, are you moving to defer, or were you just asking questions about deferral?
Yes, I will move to defer this until June 14th to get specific answers to some of the questions that.
Okay. I need a seconder if we're going to. Okay, thank you, Councillor Barclay. Obviously, the motion is to defer the rezoning of lands at 313 Joseph Street and 322 Jack Street from the residential first density exception holding R131H to residential third density exception holding R3226H. So that's the deferral that we're considering. It's been moved and seconded. Are there any other comments? We know that we'd like some clarification around trees, traffic, I guess the amount of intensification and the rationale for that among, I think, some fencing considerations, additional drainage impacts, should there be any, and perhaps a little more insight into waste management, visitor parking, minimum yard requirements, and landscaping. I think I've captured most of the list. Okay. Councillor Barclay, before I call the vote?
Yeah, just a general comment before we call the vote is that if you're a resident of Kemptville or North Grenville, you've certainly seen a lot of change happen over time. Change is difficult to accommodate. We're all about managing change in an intelligent way. And to the developers, we do appreciate your investment in the community, but like the residents, there might be some, you should have some expectation of changing your plans a little bit too. So I thank both of you for attending and for the last couple of hours.
Yep. Okay, Councillor Strachan, before I call the vote?
Yes, Madam Mayor, I don't think you mentioned the affordable housing component in your list there, but I think that's definitely on the list.
Key, very key, yes.
And I guess since the Deputy Mayor took the opportunity to say something as well regarding all these changes, I think it's clear that the changes that are happening here isn't just about growth and having to deal with change. It's how to do it in a responsible and meaningful way. And your comments have been heard. So I know it seems like sometimes we're just up here and it's bouncing off of us, but we are listening very intently to what you say. It's complicated. It's very challenging to talk about densification, to talk about these changes to our community. We all live here. And so we want to see the best for this as well. I've chosen to raise my kids here with my partner, and so I think we want what's best for this community. The housing strategy does talk about a lot of things that we're trying to achieve here, which just isn't just about densification. It's about putting the right types of housing in place as well, and where we have gaps in the type of housing available, and bringing in the affordability aspect of it makes it even more complex. And then, the post-COVID years where everything's more expensive as well makes the whole conversation very complex. So just know that we are listening to what you're saying. We do hear what you're struggling with, and I think the long list that the Mayor has mentioned is indicative of the questions that we're going to be asking and getting more answers to. So I thank you for spending the last several hours here with us and coming up here and being passionate about it. That's that's what we want, and we're glad that you've taken the opportunity to make your thoughts known. Thank you.
Okay, are there any other comments? None. Okay, I'll call the vote. All in favor of the deferral? Okay, that passes. Echoing Councillor Strachan's comments, we've spent 2.5 hours with you. I think it's very evident that we take you seriously. We take all of our residents very seriously. We take proposed developments very seriously because often they create more opportunities for people to move here or to relocate here or to start a family here. So we look forward to getting more information from the developer and from our own staff and to having some robust dialogue. I would really encourage residents who have particular concerns that were expressed today, if you haven't gotten all the answers you need, please continue to follow up with the applicant so that you can sustain that dialogue. And that way we will, I think, have a better confidence in understanding and where things are at in a couple of months. Okay. We have another matter, Council, that I think we're going to try to get through tonight. So thank you very much. Okay. So moving on, we have a zoning bylaw amendment for 1921-1365 Beulah Road. Beulah or Beulah? Beulah. This is that Council approve and enact bylaw 4323 to amend the comprehensive zoning bylaw to rezone the property legally described as part of Lot 13, Concession 9. If we could just, oh my God. we'll try again. That council approve and enact bylaw 4323 to, to amend, okay, I'm going to try again. So Beulah, this is that council approve and enact bylaw 4323 to amend the comprehensive zoning bylaw to rezone the property legally described as part of lot 13, concession 9, from the tourist commercial special exception zone to the rural special exception zone and rural special exception zone and open space zone. So Ms. Martin, I think you have a brief presentation.
That is correct. Thank you, Your Worship. We'll just move to the next slide. Just a reminder to council where the property is located. There's been one minor change to just the location map. So back during the original public meeting, there was about a 50-acre parcel that was included as part of the zoning amendment discussion. That parcel is currently zoned rural, which permits an agricultural use and isn't part of the original lot fabric. So we've amended the zoning map to reflect that. If we go to the next slide, just some history. The original public meeting was held back on March of 9th, 2022. At that time, the decision was deferred at the request of the property owner's agent and municipal staff to allow for additional time to address the request of the municipality regarding the need for a wetland evaluation. If we go to the next slide, in regards to some significant changes that have happened in our planning worlds and certainly within the way in which we approach developments, Bill 23, which I think council is familiar with now, received royal assent back in November of last year, so quite a bit after the original public meeting for this property, which brought in far-reaching changes in regards to how wetlands are evaluated and considered. So through the Ontario Wetland Evaluation System, the manual was updated by the province as well, and we are no longer have the ability to complex wetlands as part of the evaluation process. So in the original staff report, which was provided as part of the report for this evening, it was originally recommended by the previous deputy director, Ms. Landstra, that the wetland evaluation be a requirement as the property is located between the Limerick, Indian Creek, and the Kemptville Creek provincially significant wetlands that are east and south of the property, respectively. Bill 23 has removed that ability of us to be able to complex this property from an evaluation standpoint with those surrounding wetlands. Next slide, please. So staff have received a planning justification report from JP2G, who are the agents for the property owner, and it provided provided updated information on the property in light of Bill 23 and changes to the Ontario Wetland Evaluation System Manual. This was provided to municipal staff on March 21st. Staff attended the site with the property owner on March 29th to take an assessment of the site as the northern portion had identified unevaluated wetlands. It was noted in the planning justification report that there had been significant site alteration and that there's essentially nothing there to be evaluated through the Ontario Wetland Evaluation System. Based on staff's visual assessment on the property, it's been determined and verified that the land has been significantly cleared and altered. I can verify we did walk about 1.5 kilometers back through the field to view the area. So based on our observations and the rationale provided within the justification report, staff are of the opinion that the property has been significantly altered from its original state, and it is less likely that an evaluation would identify wetlands at the property, given the alteration that has already occurred, and given the changes to the manual itself in regards to the complexing features and the requirements through that process. So at this time, staff have updated the zoning bylaw amendment, and we're not recommending to implement the holding provision to require the wetland evaluation, again, just given those changes and observations that were made on site. Next slide, please. Megan's on the ball. She's like... a neighboring property owner provided a proposal to staff for a 100-meter buffer behind their residence. So at the original public meeting of council recalls, there were concerns from an adjacent landowner in regards to just the impact of the property from now having a newly established agricultural use, which is cash cropping, next to their property. The proposal put forth by the neighboring property owner was not supported by the owner of 1365 Beulah, who instead provided a counter proposal to provide a 30-meter treed buffer And just from a planning perspective, 30 meters is the standard environmental buffer that the municipality utilizes around sensitive features such as watercourses, and is often a minimum setback from that we maintain from a provincially significant wetland. So typically, there are no buffer areas or setbacks from a residential use to an agricultural use, but given that there's a change in use occurring next to this existing residence, staff have agreed that a 30-meter buffer from a planning perspective is appropriate. Before you is the proposed planting plan. So the plan is to plant 21 Norway spruce with a spacing of 8 meters average width. Of the trees would be around 8 meters at maturity. The recommended height of the trees to be planted are 2 feet, which would result in a 10-foot tall tree in about 5 years. An approximate timeline to establish the visual buffer is 10 to 15 years. So we did provide this information to the neighboring property owner, who provided comment back that they'd still like to see a larger buffer. They asked questions in regards to demarcation of that buffer area, which we'd be putting into an open space zoning. So if we go to the next slide, it just provides the proposed zoning provisions. They would like to see a fence. The property owner at 1365 Beulah had indicated that they would stake out the boundary of the property, or that open space buffer as to where that location is to be, and they have indicated to municipal staff that the property owner of 1365 Beulah Road would be willing to invest and get a planting team out there as soon as possible once conditions are favorable to get the trees in the ground. One thing I do want to note to council is that under our site plan control bylaw that the municipality has, I cannot regulate the property through site plan control because it is an agricultural use. So I wouldn't have the ability to, other than putting the zoning into the open space, I wouldn't have the ability to regulate any kind of landscaping or fencing associated with it. So the proposal before council in regards to the revised zoning bylaw amendment would be to put the property into that RU63 zone. That exception zone would limit the use to agricultural uses, but prohibit agricultural buildings and structures. And then, again, the open space zoning would be codified from a zone standard perspective to be measured out 30 meters from the rear property of that neighboring property owner. So that's how we would measure out as to where the open space zoning starts. And if we go to the final slide, staff are supportive of the proposed rezoning as presented this evening, including the changes that have been brought forth based on the changes brought through more recent provincial legislation and the justification reports provided by the agent on the file, and are recommending that council support the proposed zoning amendment as presented. Thank you.
Okay, so we'll just note that the residents that have been most impacted have asked for a 100-meter buffer, is that correct?
The original request was for a 100-meter buffer. When presented to the owner of the property, he came back with 30 meters, and then the residents said, would it be possible for a 50-meter buffer, at which point in time staff had corresponded that the property owner was willing to provide a 30-meter buffer.
Okay, but it's at council's discretion. You were here tonight proposing 30 meters. Should we want to go beyond that 30 meters, it is at council's discretion, is that correct?
That is correct, Your Worship. Council can amend the resolution and provide that direction.
Okay. Well, I would like to see a slightly larger buffer in terms of that open space, because I do think it allows for a little more distance between competing uses, one of which is residential, the other of which is agricultural. So certainly I would look to other council colleagues to see if they have an appetite to increase the open space buffer. Councillor Barclay?
Yeah, I've got a fundamental question about this open space designation. How do we enforce that? I mean, past behavior of some property owners, they haven't respected the zoning, so what is our recourse if the open space zoning is not respected?
So the municipality has the ability to enforce the requirements of the zoning bylaw. So there would be enforcement through the Planning Act, which would then be through provincial offenses. So there would be the ability, should that not be respected, for the municipality to basically issue charges underneath the Planning Act through the provincial offenses process.
Councillor Barclay?
Would you indulge me one other question? And I don't know if this should go, Madam Mayor, to the Director of Planning or the Director of Public Works. Is it my understanding that Bill 23 now allows for the removal of unevaluated wetlands for the creation of agricultural uses? Or
The Deputy Director has more information in regards to that matter.
Through you, Your Worship, the fundamental change for Bill 23 to the Ontario wetland system is that complexing is limited. So there's still, wetlands can still be evaluated, and there's no change under that. But it's just the fact of like the physical distance between a disconnected wetland to existing provincially significant wetlands is severely limited. So that's point one. And point two is that absent any type of like formal zone protection for a wetland that a municipality would have, they don't enjoy any sort of protection. Conservation authorities do have care and control over wetlands. Some conservation authorities regulate provincially significant wetlands as well as unevaluated wetlands. Rideau Valley Conservation Authority is not one of those. They only regulate provincially significant wetlands, not the unevaluated ones. So at this current time, absent any zone, there is no protection for an unevaluated wetland within North Grenville.
So my understanding is that complexing links an unevaluated wetland with a provincially significant wetland. It links them, but that link is now broken effectively?
Yes, through you, Your Worship. Yeah, what it would do, it would not just link them, it would say this is a part of that provincially significant wetland. It becomes a part of it. It broadens the boundary. That's what has been altered through Bill 23 now, and that's what's been limited here.
And is it my understanding that it's possible to remove an unevaluated wetland for agricultural purposes?
If it does not enjoy any zone protection or other protection from a conservation authority, that is correct. It could be altered.
Any other questions, council colleagues? Councillor Sullivan?
Thank you, Madam Mayor, and through you to, I guess it would be to Director Martin. So is the owner of the adjacent land who's requested this buffer, is that owner happy with 2-foot trees? And the other question is, are Norway spruce trees native to Eastern Ontario, to this area?
I will answer the first question in that through my communication with the adjacent property owners, they did not give an indication in regards to whether they were satisfied or not satisfied with the proposed tree planting plan. I think the concern was more so ensure, one, the buffer area, and two, how are we demarcating the buffer area? And there was a question in regards to the environmental studies. And I would have to follow up in regards to whether the Norway spruce is a native species to the area.
Thank you. And prior to this land being altered, were there trees on that land?
Through your worship, yes, there were trees on the land. It was cleared of trees.
Okay, so it would be reasonable to, I think, to expect that they wouldn't have to wait a full 5 to 10 years to have trees back there. So I wonder why 2-foot trees that are going to take, what did it say, 10 to 15 years to mature into being a reasonable buffer isn't really adequate. But and to go from 100-meter buffer down to 30 is like a third of what was requested. So I would think that increasing that buffer to maybe 50 meters would be reasonable. and improving the tree height.
Okay, so just, and then I'll recognize you, Councillor Strachian. I keep looking over, so I apologize if I missed your hand for that 1 second. So certainly, Councillor O'Sullivan, you can make a proposal to amend the amount of buffering, whether it be 50 or 60. And I think if you wanted to include a stipulation around tree height, Ms. Martin, that would be acceptable as part of an amendment?
I cannot regulate that through zoning. That's not a mechanism I would have. And in regards to the question about it being a native species, yes, Norway spruce is native.
So you could insert into the motion planting trees, but not the height of trees?
I can't even insert into the motion,
I see.
sorry, Your Worship. The planting of trees, that it was an offer that was provided by the property owner who is here this evening in regards to wanting to provide a visual buffer screen versus just keeping it as like an open landscape space that could be just grass or eventually what would probably be scrub vegetation that would grow up.
Okay. Councillor Strachian?
Thank you, through you, Madam Mayor. So going back to the wetland questions. So the land has been significantly altered, is the wording that has been used. The land was altered because at some point council approved that alteration, or that alteration was allowed under the current zoning? I just want some clarification on that, please.
Through your worship, so the municipality didn't approve the alteration of the land. The municipality does not have a site alteration bylaw in which we can regulate the clearing of trees or the regrading of land or the alteration of land. So the municipality had no authority to prevent the property owner of this property or any property owner from removing the trees, whether it be for agricultural purposes or for development purposes.
Okay, but it's one of the reasons that we're using to say that we wouldn't be able to evaluate. I know Bill 23 gets in the way there, but I guess this could happen anywhere then. If the property's altered and then we look at it and we say it doesn't look like it's worth the effort, then we say because the property owner altered it, we can't do anything. There's no point in going further with this. Is that like, see where I'm sort of going with this, right? Like we can't control the alteration happens, and then we use that as a reason as to why it's no longer valuable land to evaluate from a wetland perspective.
So, through your worship, so the planning justification report that was provided through JP2G provided the rationales to what the likely outcome would be if an environmental impact study was undertaken on the portion of the land, and just one being the Bill 23 changes in regards to being able to take the complexing of surrounding wetlands into consideration as to whether or not there's value in preserving that land or putting that portion of the property into a zone that would preserve it. But it also took into consideration an in-field assessment to say there is nothing here worth evaluating. The likelihood of an environmental impact study, the conclusion would be that because the land's been altered so significantly, there's no ability for the land to regenerate to provide that benefit of providing protection. And because it wasn't previously protected under zoning, municipality had no recourse to go back and say you can't alter it or proceed through other enforcement channels to do so. And as Mr. Mosher has provided, our Conservation Authority also doesn't provide that level of protection around unevaluated wetlands. So from that perspective, there would have been little recourse on the part of the Conservation Authority to be able to go in and issue any kind of fines or charges underneath their regulations.
Okay. So perhaps, I guess the consideration that I think that we need to think about as a council is that as we're moving forward with all of these zoning changes and everything that comes along with it, is that if we don't put the protections in the first place, then we run into the situation where lands are altered, legally allowable, alterations are happening, and then we say there's nothing of significance here. So it's kind of a, because the work wasn't done earlier to protect it, then we wind up with what could have been something that was valuable is no longer valuable. And I can see how we get there. Once the damage is done, you can't undo it in this case. So I think that that's perhaps food for thought as we move forward with all these kinds of changes. The other question that I have is that, had under the circumstances where we go out and we look at it and we do a visual assessment and so on, is that deemed an appropriate way without having the experts in place to make those judgment calls to say, we don't think it's worth evaluating? I know Bill 23 gets in the way, so it's a hypothetical at this stage, but if we look at it and we go out there and we say our assessment is that we shouldn't do it, my personal opinion is, conservation authorities that have those specialists are there for a reason. They're the ones that are the ones that can make those calls because they have the appropriate expertise.
So I'll have our deputy director, having previously been an environmental planner for the Conservation Authority, maybe provide some more clarification around that. Bill 23 aside, as again, council's aware, that is no longer part of the purview unless there's a impact to a water course of the Conservation Authority. So
I appreciate the questions, and I'll allow Mr. Mosher to answer. We're going to have to pass another motion to extend this council meeting if we don't pass something by 10:30. Procedurally, we cannot continue to meet. Is that my understanding? So I think we have Mr. Mosher answer. I think if we want to talk about, obviously on designated wetlands in a more fulsome way, right, as a policy practice within North Grenville, we should continue the conversation at another meeting, unless Councillor Strachan, you need this.
No, I'm just looking for clarification for this evening. We have 9 minutes left. I don't think his answer is going to take anywhere near that long, but
no,
we'll
understood. And I think the line of questioning is valuable. I'm just conscious of how much time we have left. So, Mr. Mosher, in 3 minutes or less, that's all you get.
Through you, Your Worship, I'm qualified under the OSE system for wetland evaluation, although I don't currently practice consistently, but I did go out on site with Director Martin and we looked, and from my observations, there was nothing there of significance that was left.
Thank you. I wasn't aware of your qualifications. That's good to know. Thank you.
That being said, you went post the clearing of trees, so the potential of there having been wetlands is something you couldn't have evaluated because you wouldn't have seen the property previously. Is that right?
Cardinal rule for when you're evaluating these things is you have to evaluate what's there the day that you're there.
Understood. Okay. Great. Okay. So the motion is before us, and I think there was some suggestion of considering or expanding the buffer. So if that's something that a member of council wants to put forward, then please do so now. Otherwise, I'll call the question. Okay, go ahead.
Yeah, I'd be in favor of the motion with the amendment to double the width of the buffer zone.
The open space, that's what we're calling it.
Open space, sorry, yes.
Yep, okay. Okay, so Councillor Barclay is making a friendly amendment. Councillor Sullivan?
Thank you. I don't know if it's appropriate or not, but when I'm looking at this slide, the recommendation was to plant 21 Norway spruce trees with the spacing, et cetera, and the height of 2 feet. So if this buffer is being widened, then I would actually, probably the 21 trees might still be sufficient, but I would suggest that they be at least 4 feet high. I don't think it's fair that the resident has to wait 10 to 15 years to get a visual buffer. We don't have jurisdiction, but it still is a recommendation, so.
It's a staff recommendation as a result of a good faith conversation with the property owner?
That's the proposal that the property owner through their agents, JP2G, have provided. But again, we have no jurisdiction to regulate the height of trees, the location of the trees, the planting of the trees. This is a goodwill gesture on the part of the property owner to try and address the buffering issues being experienced by the neighbor.
So the information is provided for context?
Yes,
not for decision-making by council?
So the only decision that council has the authority to decide on is the open space. The zoning is presented in regards to the rural exception zone to permit the agricultural use, as well as the buffer zone.
Okay.
So if the property owner is present and would be agreeable on as a goodwill gesture to increase the height of the trees, then that could be something that we could write into this, is that correct?
I can't write in the height of the trees.
Okay.
So maybe it's a follow-up. We will not get through the rezoning if you come down and speak because we're very limited by time. I think members of council are happy to hear from you after the fact. Is there anything that you have to say that's relevant to the rezoning? Okay. Mhm. Okay, we appreciate those comments. That being said, Councillor Sullivan, you've moved a doubling of the buffer. Has that been seconded as a friendly amendment? Do it? Yeah, I'm sorry, you moved it, and Councillor O'Sullivan seconded it. Okay, thank you. We've obviously heard from Mr. Scouten. That being said, the friendly amendment has been moved and seconded. I'm going to just call the question on the friendly amendment. All in favor of the amendment to a 60-meter buffer? So I need you to raise your hands. Okay. So that carries. So now we're back to the fundamentals of the rezoning. And that is that, as I've read it before, that we rezone the property legally described as part of Lot 13, Concession 9, from the Tourist Commercial Special Exception Zone to the Rural Special Exception Zone and Rural Special Exception Zone and Open Space Zone. So are there any other questions on that rezoning? Seeing none, I'll call it. I'm sorry? Yes, but it just refers to an open space zone in the rezoning. We understand that open space zone is now 60 meters. Correct, Ms. Martin?
You will need to amend the motion to add in the 60-meter buffer.
Okay, thank you. Ms. Workman is on it. Thank you. Subject to, okay, so the open space zone is subject to the amendment to 60 meters from 30 meters. So that is part of the motion now. Thank you. Thank you for that question. Okay, so with that in mind, I'll call the question. All in favor, please, of the rezoning? Okay. Any opposition to the rezoning? Okay. So that rezoning carries, and I'm just going to go to our confirmation bylaw. I think that's where we are right now. And I'm sorry, I don't have the language in front of me, Ms. Workman.
That the bylaw 4523 to confirm the proceedings of council at its regular meeting held April 12th, 2023 be adopted and passed.
Okay, a mover and a seconder, please. Thank you. Councillor Barclay, I'm going to need a seconder. Thank you. Confirmation bylaw, all in favor, please raise your hands. And I think all we need is a motion to adjourn.
Correct.
There are no members of the media. There are no questions from, okay, good. So we're adjourning at 10:28 p.m. Actually just turned 10:29, so 10:29 p.m. I'll need a mover and a seconder to adjourn. Councillor Strachan, Councillor O'Sullivan, and I'll call the question on adjournment at 10:29.